Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this DTN Ag Summit Series event. I'm DTN Farm Business Editor Katie Dehlinger. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I know a few of you heard our farmers chattering in the background. We're having a few audio technology issues. We're trying to get it so they can hear me so we can do a panel discussion. Before we get to some of our content, we're going to change it up a little bit. We're going to share a conversation. We're going to move ahead to our Dicamba video while we figure out that technical part. Before we get there, I want to tell you a little bit about Whova, our platform. I'm glad that you're here joining us and watching, and you've got me probably in the center of your screen. To the right-hand side, you've got a number of different questions or things that you can do. There's a Q&A spot, which is where you can drop any questions you have for our farmers or our expert participants throughout the day. There's a chat box where I see few of you have used to mention that you've seen a little bit about our technology issues this morning. There's also some live poll questions that will show up there throughout the day, linked to different sessions. Please take a moment to answer those. They add some color and some interactive elements that we like to do here with our DTN Ag Summit Series events. We're so grateful to have you all with us. I want to introduce our first speaker today. His name is KJ Johnson. He's the president of the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association. He's also a farmer in central Illinois, just north of the Champaign area, and he's going to be talking a little bit about some of the revised rules for dicamba, as well as some of the things that farmers need to think about this season when they're working with their fertilizer retailers. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my conversation with him, which happened early last week. All right. I want to say that KJ did welcome a baby girl over the weekend, so we're very happy for him and everyone is doing well. I also want to say thank you for sticking with us. We know we got a little bit of a later start this morning. It's kind of like planting season. You get that planter all set up and then all of a sudden something's not working and you're looking around, you can't figure it out. Well, it's that knob you never touched that needed to be adjusted in just the right way. So we've got it all figured out. We're looking at it, but I want to go back and just kind of start off the top again. We're really looking at the status of the crop in this event today. We're looking at, how it's really growing in different parts of the country. USDA updated its crop progress report yesterday and said that corn is about 81% planted nationally. On soybeans, it's about 66%. Both those numbers are ahead of the 5-year average and quite a bit ahead of last year, big jumps from last week. And you look at it from a state breakdown, and Illinois and Iowa are pretty close to being done with corn planting, about 85 and 84% done with soybeans. Indiana and Ohio are lagging a little bit on both of those numbers. Minnesota's struggled with some rain, so the bean number there is really kind of behind compared to some of the other states in the Midwest. And so throughout today, we're going to be visiting with farmers from different parts of the country to really get a sense of what it looks like on the ground. Because what USDA puts out in these crop progress numbers that everyone looks at, they're averages. They don't tell a full picture. They can give a range, they can give an idea, but it's always different when you talk to farmers on the ground. So I want to bring in two farmers that I visit with regularly for different things. The first is Marc Arnusch. He is a farmer from Keensburg, Colorado. He was a member of the DTN View from the Cab series last year. If you're familiar with that, it's a weekly series where we sort of track throughout the growing season. The second farmer is Erik Oberbroekling. He is in eastern Iowa. I know Erik through a lot of my conversations on grain marketing. He is very savvy in that space. I also have seen him at TPAP a few times, so we've had a lot of good conversations around the management side. Erik, Mark, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Great. I want to go ahead and have each of you introduce yourself, tell me a little bit about where you farm, what your crop mix is, a little bit about your business operation and that philosophy. Let's go ahead and start with Mark, and then when you're done, we'll go to Erik.
Well, thank you for having us here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. My family farms just northeast of Denver, about 35 miles. We farm in what's called Prospect Valley, which has been a long-standing agricultural community for a long, long time. Our family farms about 4,000 acres, and when I say our family, that includes my son, Brett, who just started his farming operation a few years ago, and my niece and nephew, Taylor Ann and Casey Cantwell. So together we farm about 4,000 acres. We primarily focus on growing seed wheat, seed barley, grains for the craft beer and spirits industry. And then we grow quite a bit of feed ingredients for the livestock sector. In about a 4-mile radius from my farming operation here, we have 2 large dairies. And so we have quite a few acres of corn that goes there, a few acres of alfalfa that goes to the dairy market. But water touches everything in eastern Colorado, so we depend very much on irrigated agriculture. We have very few acres that are actually dry farms. So agriculture is driven by water here locally, and without it, we don't accomplish much.
All right, thanks. Erik, what about you?
Well, once again, I'll echo Mark's thoughts, and thank you for the opportunity to be with everybody this morning, and hope everybody's growing season is off to a stellar start. As Katie mentioned, we farm in northeastern Iowa, a little corner of the Iowa known as the driftless region. This part of Iowa is not flat like most of Iowa is. As I sit here on my office, I can see the Wisconsin bluff line. We're rolling, we're hilly. The glacier did not flatten us out. I farm with my dad and brother. I'm third generation on the operation here. Family started this in the 60s. But we farm about similar size to Mark, that mid 4,000 acre range. Pretty standard Iowa fare. Corn, soybeans. We do grow some non-GMO soybeans for the export market. Located near Mississippi River Terminal. The bulk of our soybeans all do go to the export market, whether commercial or non-GMO. Most of our corn is grown for either the ethanol market or the export market. Final destination varies year to year. The last couple of years, a good chunk that has went to ethanol. Basis in the interior, central Iowa, has actually been better than our river basis. So we've funneled some corn literally against the grain and moved grain westward into central Iowa, which normally, historically, 15, 20 years ago, almost all the grain flowed eastward to the river for export market if it did not get put through a feed mill. My wife is an appraiser with People's Company Real Estate out of Des Moines. So farmland appraiser is who I cohabitate with daily. Good side information, a lot of sideline information to have there in the ag real estate space. We also run a trucking business, a small fleet of 20 trucks running around the upper Midwest primarily, hauling milk, feed grains. We do all some silica sand for the frac industry. Got a small fleet of 20 trucks. Got about 30-some people on the payroll, part-time, full-time, between the farm side and the truck side. So that's kind of our business in a nutshell.
All right. Well, I think you guys both, you've got very different businesses, but you kind of approach it, from what I've learned from talking with both of you over the years, is that you've got a really good business forward mindset. And so let's maybe talk about the topic du jour today. Let's talk about this spring planting season, how it's going, how it's growing, depending on the crops you've got going out there. And let's maybe kick it right back to you, Erik. Tell us a little bit how your corn and bean planting has gone this year.
Pretty stellar spring from a planting standpoint. Had a wide open window around actually right around crop insurance date here in Iowa, which is the 11th, 12th of April. Some folks took advantage of that. We kind of passed on that window. We were hauling some of our non-GMO soybeans out, so we were preoccupied. The folks that did plant there, everything turned out fine, albeit they got about 5 inches of snow on top of that crop after it was planted. We got started planting here about the 26th, 27th of April. Conditions were good. Started with soybeans and corn pretty much at the same time. We run 2 planters in our operation. Typically, they leave the yard the same day. Trend here in Iowa and Illinois, some of the upper Midwest, has been to plant soybeans first if the ground conditions warrant. And I'd say a lot of operations took advantage of that here this year. But by and large, a couple rain events, planting went very, very well, though. Our crop is all on the ground. I think area-wide here in my corner of Iowa, you'd have to drive pretty far and wide to find a field of soybeans not planted, and corn, the same story. Most everything's in the ground. Emergence is relatively good. I had one small, maybe a crummy window to plant, I think around the 12th, 13th of May. Some areas planted and got 3-4 inches of hard rain afterwards. I've heard of a few emergence problems there, but by and large, things are off to a stellar start, and our moisture situation is good.
All right, and Mark, how about you? How's your planting been going? How have conditions been for you?
Planting for us actually starts in the fall of the previous year. A lot of our acres are hard red winter wheat. A lot of that went into the ground in the best shape planting conditions that we've had in a very long time. We've easily got the best stand establishment in our hard red winter wheat that we've had in the last 4 or 5 years. That was really, we benefited quite a bit from the monsoon moistures that we had last fall, and that certainly carried us through the winter and into the spring. We benefited from quite a bit of snow through the wintertime months that insulated that wheat crop significantly and provided us quite a bit of precip and moisture opportunities in the spring. Next, our seed barley acres went in the ground in very good conditions. We had a weather event shortly thereafter that boosted emergence quite a bit. And those two crops in particular are in very good shape. Probably the best start we've had in almost a decade with those two crops combined. Next up for us was corn. We got a lot of that corn put in before we had a recent weather event come through. We still have a few acres to go on some of the dry land to plant, but we're very much on track in terms of planting potential. Crop has emerged for the most part. We went through about a 2.5 to 3 inch rain event over about a week period this last month, which we're in really good shape. The dilemma that we're faced with right now is our irrigation water supplies. We're on the backside of another 3 or 4 year drought cycle, and in many of the reservoirs, the lakes, the infrastructure that we divert water from the South Platte River, we're empty going into winter. And it's taken quite a bit for our snowpack to replenish those supplies. So our water situation on our farm this year is still very much in a dire nature. We're looking at actually having less irrigation water this year than what we actually even had in 2022. But in eastern Colorado, one thing is for sure, and that is it can change. And with this weather system that we had come through a couple weeks ago, and certainly with what's being predicted in the next week to 10 days, I would imagine our irrigation water supplies will improve significantly. So long story short, we're in a really good shape. This is easily the best start that we've had to a crop in a very long time.
So Mark, I know that, the hard red winter wheat situation is not the same all across the country. We know that Kansas, it's really struggling. The question is how much of that crop is going to be abandoned. Now, is most of your wheat acreage going into your seed business, or is some of that going to go into the commercial market this year?
Well, we've worked really hard over the last 10 years or so to try to decommoditize the commodity, meaning that we try to grow a value-added crop, whether it's on the seed side of things or in our relationships with the craft distillers and brewers. And so all of our crop is definitely going to go into those two areas, but you don't have to travel very far south of here to get into some more of those challenged wheat acres. In fact, once you head south of I-70 here in Colorado, you start to see quite a few wheat acres that are stressed. And then you work your way into the southeast quarter of Colorado, into Oklahoma and into Kansas. And that's the toughest wheat crop I've seen anywhere in my travels. But most of our markets are somewhat set. Our seed business is very vibrant. We ship our seed product to about 20 to 25 different states and several foreign countries. So we've worked hard to build that marketplace for us.
Thank you, Mark. Now, I know, Erik, you said that there might be some spotty replanting of soybeans in your area. How much of that, or I guess how much of your crop do you do in the non-GMO beans, and how has that changed over the years?
Yeah, Katie, the non-GMO bean market, it varies year to year. Typically, the last couple, 2-3 years, our soybean crop, roughly between 3/4 and I'd say 80% of our soybeans have been in the non-GMO space. There's a time period 4 or 5 years ago, for about 5 years, probably from the, I'd say, 2010 till probably a decade till 2020. Didn't grow any non-GMO soybeans, grew all, traded soybeans. Approached our grain terminal. I don't think they've had markets, 15, 20 years ago. Approached them one year about the possibility of growing non-GMO beans. Didn't throw it real far, as the prior presenters stated. A lot of farmers make their seed plans, the fall of the year, the combine. I had all my traded seed bought. Fast forward to March, about 6 weeks, 7 weeks ahead of planning, I get a phone call. We'd like you to grow non-GMO beans. So switch gears, redirect, send seed back, find new seed, source new seed, switch to the non-GMO arena. The premiums have been slowly coming up over the last couple of years. I know for this year, the 2023 growing season, my intentions were to somewhat back out of the non-GMO arena due to weed control issues, bin space, number of acres, trying to get the acres going with the bin space, so on and so forth. And they literally, the buyer came back to me and basically asked me what would it take premium-wise to get us to grow a non-GMO bean. So the demand is there. acreage is down. Like I said, demand is there and acres are down. And I've heard from both, CGB, Cargill, take your pick of the bigs as far as who purchases the non-GMO beans. Kind of the same reasons as far as why production is down. When commodity price, when commercial beans are $15, $16, it's easy to press the easy button, not worry about going after a premium product or premium price. And as commodity prices fall back down, now suddenly, $1.50, $2.50 a bushel starts to talk and mean something again. So that's, in a sense, that's why the production side of the non-GMO market is slumped. Well, demand is still there the last couple of years with these elevated commodity prices. The last couple of weeks in the soybean market may change a tune, or I'm not sure where we're going in the future as far as commodity prices. But that, the extra couple bucks a bushel, in our opinion, our operation, make growing beans competitive with growing corn, or as far as our rotation standpoint.
Especially in some of those years where, like you said, the prices are not as good, that makes a difference. Have you had much issue with any of the different drift issues that's going on there? Is the weed control trouble you're facing really based on the resistance within the fields?
Nothing really with the drift issue so much. I mean, if you've got a neighbor planting enlist beans or trail or Ingenia beans, they're going to drift on non-GMO beans and smoke them off, same as they would a traded bean that's got the wrong traits in it. So the drift issues really aren't an issue for us. Weed resistance, that's more of a field by field location. We seemingly water hemp, and Palmer, two majors across the country as far as weed resistance. We fight some water hemp here. Giant ragweed tends to be another hot button weed in our area that we fight to control on the non-GMO side. Them are the two weeds that are probably the biggest reasons why we've considered going away from the non-GMO soybeans, albeit, spray early, spray often. If you can see weeds from the pickup, drive by the field, you're probably too late with the non-GMO side of things. Just, scout early, spray early and often. That's your best defense in the non-GMO world.
So, Mark, I know that you've got a different set of climatological conditions out there in Colorado. What are some of the weeds you struggle with, and what's your approach to managing them?
Well, we have three weeds that we try to battle each and every year. They seem to be the same culprits all the time. It's kochia, and kochia. But we do have a few other minor weeds that are starting to enter in that we're finding a little bit of herbicide resistance to, and they're a little bit of surprise to us. We're seeing a little bit of barnyard grass starting to show some tolerance to glyphosate in particular, especially when the timing elements are not necessarily perfect. The other one we're starting to see a little bit of tolerance to is lamb's quarter. I don't know if that's a real common weed in a large part of the Midwest, but we're starting to see lamb's quarter coming in on us a little harder than before. But kochia is clearly the toughest weed we have to find or fight. And if we don't do something with kochia when it's about the size of a quarter or a 50-cent piece, we have a really hard time keeping it under control. We're starting to incorporate a little bit more tillage in a few acres that typically we don't want to do. Keeping residue here in eastern Colorado during our wind events is really important to us. We want to keep as much residue on the land as possible. But then we're trying to take a different approach in how we're timing some of our sprays, especially in our cereal crops. We'll hit that field 2 and sometimes 3 times with a herbicide tank mix just to stay ahead of the kochia pressure. And then last but not least, one thing that's really starting to creep into our area, which is a little bit unusual, and I think it's really driven a lot by our moisture situation that we have here this year, is we're starting to see a lot of stripe rust entering in on some of our wheat fields. And so today we're actually putting on our second application of fungicide, and we'll likely do one more before heading.
Okay. Well, I want to just throw this out to the audience. If you have any questions for Mark or Erik, please drop them into the Q&A section and I'll ask them. I'm going to keep going with my line of questions, but if you have any, I would love to answer your questions as well. So next up, I want to just say, what's your sort of outlook on the season, guys? How are you feeling? Are you optimistic? Are you worried? What's your feel? Let's go ahead and toss it over to you, Erik.
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and start. As I've said before, we're super blessed with the kind of year that we're having this year as compared to what it was in 2022. 2022 for us was one of the toughest years that I've experienced in my farming career. But in terms of the agronomic piece of our operation, we're in really good shape. The crop could not be in a better situation here currently. We are suffering a little bit from some cool temperatures, but That's not really a problem for us. Everything is on track. I feel where our challenges are right now is it feels like this year's the year of the hedger. We're certainly trying to do a lot of things in hedging our corn crop and trying to do things to top off a little bit of our marketplace with our value-added crops such as wheat seed and certainly on the malt side. But we're getting pretty aggressive on the marketing side. And in fact, we're even marketing out a little bit into 2024 already, just because we feel this decline is starting to get a little heavier in the marketplace than what we're comfortable with. Now, granted, here farming in the eastern plains of Colorado and the high plains, we benefit from a robust livestock market. So our corn basis in particular is very strong, but it certainly feels that this is going to be the year of the hedger. So we're trying to do everything we can to take risk off the table.
I would probably echo a lot of Mark's thoughts and words. Agronomic-wise here in eastern Iowa, we're sitting in a really good spot. Spring came off without a hitch. And, ideal weather, got a good moisture situation here. So yeah, but as far as agronomy-wise, we're as good as we can be given where we could be given the calendar year. I mean, would like to maybe plant a couple weeks sooner, but ideally sitting well there. Agree on the marketing side. This year, I mean, I told somebody the other day, for the first time in a couple of years, I'm hauling forward contracted grain in that is actually worth more than the spot market. That hasn't happened the last couple of years. Yeah, and that mentality has caused a lot of folks, I think, to drag their feet on marketing this 2023 crop or even finishing up the 2022 old crop year. The last couple of years, the Danny Do-Nothings or Johnny-Come-Latelys have been the ones that have been rewarded in the marketing side of things. So on our operation here, we typically buy revenue protection from a crop insurance side of things. I upped the coverage level this year. I'm usually not a huge believer in breaking the bank in crop insurance. We bought 85% insurance with a rev boost kicker to get to a 90% coverage level. This year, again, like as Mark said, just feels like the year of the hedger or the year that, just going into spring, you can have a super good guarantee. When a falling market, it felt like the year if you're going to do that and pull that trigger, this felt like the year to make that crop insurance decision. I don't know, hopefully come fall, if crop insurance expires worthless, prices rebound from where they are right now, that'd be great. But in all honesty, just doing risk management and mitigating risk, that's crucial this year to success, in my opinion.
I think, guys, that's something that we've heard from a lot of different people visiting this spring. Something we talked about a lot in our last Ag Summit Series event at the end of February was about how the different marketing conditions. I know, Erik, you just spoke a little bit about your crop insurance program. I know, Mark, you've got a very different approach to crop insurance on your farm.
Yeah, we insure very differently, and that's due to our diversification and the value-added crops that we grow. We don't carry a revenue insurance program. We don't carry a multi-peril insurance program. We insure through what's called whole farm, and it's based upon your farm gate revenue. And for us, it's been working extremely well. It helps us insure those crops that are typically non-insurable at the levels that we have investment in them, such as some of our seed crops. It allows us to cover up some of our marketing mistakes that we make from time to time. And it helps kind of smooth out the ebbs and flows of year-over-year cash flow. Without whole farm crop insurance, I don't know that my farm operation would still exist in the size and the scope that it's in. It's certainly helped us out significantly in 2022. It really smoothed out some bumps in 2018 for us. In 2018, we had the toughest farming year we've ever experienced. We had 11 hailstorms on our farm, and we only harvested about 15% of our acres that year. And I don't know another policy that could have allowed us to cover as many costs as we did, keep us in the game, and fight for another year. And so I'm a huge proponent of whole farm policy insurance for those who have the diversification and the value-added crops that we have.
It's just a different type of program that a lot of farmers aren't used to, so I thought I'd ask you about it and share that. I've got a couple of questions coming in. This first one's for Erik. What are your non-GMO soybeans used for?
They end up in the Korean market, that's the export market. As far as what the end user used them for there, I don't know. They're a non-variety specific soybean. We can plant any non-GMO variety available on the market. They're not a clear hilum. They're not a tofu bean or food grade of sort. Just a standard non-variety specific non-GMO bean.
All right. And Mark, this question's for you. Do you and other area farmers have to deal with water allotments like Colorado or California and Arizona farmers? If yes, how much have they been cut over the years? How do your water allotments work?
So we're on the eastern slope of Colorado, so we're not subject to a lot of the rules and regulations that those that farm in the Colorado River Basin struggle with. Out there in California, their allocations are driven more so by the compact requirements, and I know I'm getting way too much in the weeds for many of your viewers, but here in eastern Colorado, we depend on river flows. And in Colorado, we have a doctrine of prior appropriations that means when we're in time and when we're in priority, we can divert from the river. The biggest challenges that we're facing, quite frankly, originates in conservation. Our water systems here in the state of Colorado have always benefited from the lack of conservation. And as more municipalities in particular become more intelligent with the use of their water, they have less waste. That waste typically has come into our river basin in the past, and we've been able to divert with it and irrigate with it. But as those conservation measures are starting to go in upstream of us, our river flows have been greatly reduced. This has been a trend that's continued throughout the entire career that I've had in farming. But we're becoming more nimble and innovative. We're partnering with a lot of municipalities to receive some of their return flows to our river. We're becoming more water wise on the farm because conservation on the farm certainly looks different than what it does in a town. And we're making every water droplet matter more. And we're just growing more crop with each acre feet that we're able to utilize.
Thanks, Mark. Now this question is a little bit more forward-looking for you guys. It's both of you are focused on finding some value-added crops and adding to that mix. Are there any crops or crop uses, or I'll add business lines, that you're looking to exploring to boost your profits?
Well, Eric, I'll go ahead and take this one. What we're really trying to do on our farm is what I mentioned earlier, is we're trying to decommoditize the commodity. We grow a lot of our crops in the shadows of a very vibrant and growing front range. And I never thought when I graduated from college I'd ever have to defend agriculture or advocate for agriculture. But that's where we find ourselves at right now. And so we're trying to grow that interface with the consumer. We're trying to do that through something that's maybe less politically charged, and then that's in the alcohol space. It's hard to argue over a beer, and it's kind of a little difficult to find conflict when you're sipping really good whiskey. So we're trying to use that and create that bridge to production agriculture and justify a lot of the things that we're doing. That's certainly one area. And the other area we're spending a lot of time in is growing the R&D side of our business. We do a lot of genetic research for universities and for seed companies in the wheat and the barley space. In fact, we're actually moving away from seed production for wheat because our barley business has grown so much, but we still do a lot of the research trialing on our farm, which gives us a leg up on what genetics are coming down the road. It gives us an opportunity to collaborate with a lot of the seed genetic providers, and it gives us a really good look at not only what's working in the field, but what also works through the fermentation process as well.
And our operation here, taking the longer road, looking forward, Iowa, the upper Midwest, typically corn, soybeans, that's where it's at. It's pretty hard to really reinvent that wheel. The non-GMO side of things, that definitely is helping our bottom line from the soybean side of things in our business. Longer-term growth here are things we're kind of looking out at. As I mentioned earlier, we run a trucking business in addition to farming. I always joke that's kind of our livestock. Some people get up and do chores in the morning. I get up and deal with broke-down trucks or truck drivers, so that's my livestock chore to deal with every day. But really, what we're trying to do there, we hear from a lot of folks, the shippers and receivers we work with, that we just need more trucking companies like yours. You guys are just awesome to work with, yada, yada, yada. And I'm not trying to pat ourselves on the back. I really don't think we're doing anything special. What I really boil it down to, we're taking that agricultural farm work ethic, drive, dedication, just common sense. If something's wrong, we call, we communicate. Take that work ethic and put that into a non-agricultural space, a business of some sort. It happens to be trucking for us. It could be landscape, could be who knows what for anybody else. A lot of the Joe Blow consumers are just people aren't used to dealing with down-to-earth human beings anymore. And if you can really, in our opinion, if you can take that ag work ethic, put it in a non-ag space, you're going to really set yourself up for success and the ability to jump forward by leaps and bounds by just doing what we in production ag and farming think is commonplace and second nature to us. I mean, our model in our farm business and truck business is we're rooted in agriculture and driving forward, and we really try and emphasize that with the customers we work with on the truck side, that, you know, we've got that farm background. We know how to make hay when the sun shines, and our word is good, and a handshake still means something. So that's what we're really trying to focus on in our business, just, you know, taking that ag work ethic and punching that into a non-ag space.
Great. Now, our last question of the day, what is it that keeps you up at night? What worries you? Where are your concerns?
Mark, I don't want me to take it.
Oh, well, a lot of things keep me up awake at night, but little of them have to do with what I've done throughout the course of the day. I guess at the end of the day, what really keeps me awake at night is making sure that I'm in a mode of teaching. I've got a very young staff within our farming operation. All but one of them are under the age of 30. And so I'm trying to instruct some of the perils that I found myself in over my 28-year farming career, and try to make sure that I impart as much of that information that I've experienced over time. But the other thing that is starting to not necessarily concern me, it's actually exciting me, which keeps me awake at night, is the evolution of a lot of the technology in our space, especially that in the AI platform. We've experienced a few things on our farm with artificial intelligence that is moving the ball forward for us. It's pretty exciting to see some real solution-based outcomes come. It's really fascinating to see how that space is beginning to grow. Obviously, there's a little bit of concern there, but the technology that's coming to us is allowing us to be better farmers all the time. We're taking better care of our land, we're taking better care of our water, and we're doing it better than the generations before us because of tools like this. And so I think it's the excitement that likely keeps me awake at night, not necessarily the headwinds, because I spent way too much of my farming career worrying about those things I can't control.
I would say in our world here, as far as things keep me up at night, just the financial management of what tomorrow looks like. I'm a numbers guy. I like numbers. I crunch numbers. That's just kind of what makes me tick, makes me go. And what the next opportunity is going to be, or searching for it. You know, production ag, we pretty well, I won't say we've mastered it. We can always got a lot of things we can learn and look at to improve our farm business. But what's the next big opportunity for us? Those are things that keep me up at night. In addition to just making sure, you know, in the truck world especially, we've got a pretty large crew of folks who work for us, and in the trucking world, there's not a lot of long-term commitment or contracts, and things can change on a moment's notice. One of my biggest fears is just being able to make sure we've got opportunity and something for everybody to do that expects a paycheck from us and comes here every day as part of our team. They go home and feel rewarded, and really, in all honesty, just making sure they feel like they are a part of something more than just a number. Nobody likes to come to work every day and feel like they're just a body. It's really that keep me up at night trying to figure out how to get them engaged actively, wholeheartedly in our business model, feel like they belong here and have a sense of purpose. That's, again, we're doing a pretty good job at it, but that's an evergreen process trying to, you know, keep people feeling engaged, that they belong, that they enjoy the work, and they enjoy their time spent with us. Because in all honesty, any farm employee or any employee in a business, they probably spend more time with us and our businesses day to day than they do their spouse or kids as far as a waking hours standpoint. So trying to make them have a rewarding experience, that's what keeps me up at night, real honestly.
Well, it sounds like you guys both share that concern, working and educating your staffs, trying to grow your business through your people. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning. Thank you for sticking with us through some of our early technical difficulties. We appreciate your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you for joining me. Now I'd like to introduce Kevin Johnson. He's the president of the Illinois Fertilizer and Chemical Association. He'll be here joining us today to talk about a variety of things that are on par with today's course. He's in central Illinois. He'll give us a crop update of how the corn and bean crops are looking in that area. He's also going to tell us a little bit about the revised rules for Dicamba. The EPA did update that label in February of this year, so there are some changes there that farmers need to be aware of. And then we're also going to talk about some of the agronomy needs to know. I think he's got some messages he'd like to share on just working with retailers in this season and some of the unique conditions. So KJ, thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to have you here.
Hey, thanks a lot, Katie, on this nice, beautiful day. So we are in pretty good shape. I actually farm with my father and two brothers in central Illinois, just north of Champaign. Corn is all coming up, and I mean, it's right there spiking on through. We are actually ahead on soybeans, so all our soybeans are up. So we're actually looking pretty good. If you go west of here, probably Springfield West, they literally started the week after Easter, so they're a little further ahead. And then if you go up in more the northern parts, they're just getting a good run at stuff. And I know southern Illinois is probably in the mix. So I feel like we're in pretty good shape. We did catch a rain a couple of Sundays ago that dropped about, depending where you're at, anywhere from 5/10 to 7 inches and all the way in between. I know there is going to be some replanting going on in different spots, but I think we're off to at least a further start. I mean, we got done planting on May 9th, and I looked over at my wife and said, I don't think we've ever had everything in this early. So I think we're in pretty good shape now if we, get those timely rains, but as I always say, not too much. Just a nice shower. I think we're in a pretty good spot. But there is going to be, after this rain a couple Sundays ago, there is going to have to be some spotting in of some corn and soybeans out there.
So it sounds like it was one of those springs where maybe everything wasn't planted in a super tight window like maybe last year. So maybe you got a little bit of a spread out in the planting date there.
Exactly right. So I feel like we're off to at least a good start. I think we didn't have, some springs, it's all in this 10-week or 10-day period that rush. I think it did get more kind of spread out a little bit better. So I don't feel like all the retailers or farmers had a better mental health spring, getting a little spread out rather than all getting put in one 7 to 10 day window.
So I'm glad to hear you had a little bit more of a less stressful planting season. I know that mental health aspect is a big deal for growers. What have some of the early conditions been like in the fields that you're seeing?
Always spreading out that work is a little better on everybody at the farm level to the retail level to spread that out just a little bit so it's not all on the same page. But I didn't feel like we're in a good spot. We were a little cooler. There was a lot more beans planted in my part of the world earlier. I can tell you we had all our beans in before we put the first kernel of corn in, just because it was a little cooler. It was dry, but it was cool. And guys were just kind of waiting to see. They didn't want to put that corn in quite that cool. But we made a good run, and we're in a good spot, I think, for the rest of the growing season.
So, KJ, have you seen any issues with emergence at all from all of the rain you've had this past week?
We did, but I don't see any pollination issues at all right now. Unless you got the big rain, all those beans come. As I told some people this spring, when I was younger, I thought corn could take everything and the beans could take no stress. I feel almost like it's the exact opposite. You can put those beans in the ground and you might not come up for 3 weeks, but have still everything out there. Corn, if it's out there for 3 weeks in the ground, that probably isn't going to have all the same population, but the beans really can take, it looks like a lot of abuse and still have a great stand coming up.
Well, KJ, it sounds like the crops are off to a really good start in central Illinois. Now, I want to bring up a different topic, change gears a little bit. Something that you are really familiar with is sort of the changes to the Dicamba label that EPA put into place last winter. Can you tell us a little bit more about what those changes are and what they're going to mean for farmers this planting or this growing season?
Yep. So in a handful of states, Midwest states, US EPA and the manufacturers went into agreement to change that label. In Illinois, it has always been, or up here the last few years, we had a June 20th cutoff with an 85 degree forecasted cutoff. What that means is you could not spray after the 20th, or if the forecast for that day was above by the National Weather Service, higher than 85 degrees, even if it was 72 that morning and completely calm, if it was supposed to get to 87 later that afternoon, it was a do not spray. What they have done is, on the national level, they have, in some pretty much the I states and a couple other states, moved that from June 20th to June 12th. And pretty much all the same regulations stay in effect here in Illinois. So that forecasted 85-degree forecasted date is still on there. They also put on there that you could do not spray over V4. So that is going to be effective. Whatever comes first, V4 or June 12th. If it's only stage V2 and June 12th comes first, that is a do not spray. There was a lot of conversations with EPA. We tried to have conversations. The one thing we struggle with this decision is, as an applicator, we will live with whatever decision comes out of EPA. But this came in March. And as a farmer myself, my father's farmer, our seed decisions are made next fall or last fall. In the combine, we are already making seed decisions. By January 1, to get an early discount on buying stuff, you got to have those seed decisions made. And the whole time I was talking to EPA and our retail members, if EPA or anybody's going to, or manufacturer is going to make a decision on changing that has to be in the fall when you can make those seed decisions. Now, we're going to work through that process. Whatever EPA lays out, we will work through that. But if there's any heartburn out there, it is how late that is, because guys have already paid. A retailer is already starting to get that chemical in bulk in their tanks for that. And if it changes, we got to try and live with those changes. So, again, as an ag retailers, now I'm going to say everybody loves going to June 12th, but we'll do it. As an applicator, we will make that. But that is the biggest thing that we kind of saw, just how late that going into it. Just it's going to be hard on farmers, but also on retailers. The other thing you have to remember here in Illinois, we also have that you must go through Field Watch and see if there's any sensitive areas. I used to be a board member of Field Watch. Field Watch is a great program to show you where sensitive commodity crops are at. I think everybody nationally, if you're in a state that uses field, go look at what your neighbors, because we all want to be good neighbors. We all want to coexist. Look at that website. And if your state doesn't have it, go talk to them about joining Field Watch. It's a great product. The other thing in Illinois that they have put out there, and it's been here for a couple of years, Illinois has Illinois Nature Preserve sites. And as I tell farmers and retailers, a lot of that looks like prairie grass or CRP ground. Those are sensitive areas. So if you're up against spraying up in it, that's actually a do not spray. So you really got to know where you're at. We are trying on our website to download to applicators and some files that they can kind of know and put in their system where those type of fields are, if it's a sensitive area. So those are the biggest things that we're going to have to kind of go around. I feel pretty fortunate that we got a lot of beans in the ground early. If we get some heat, that's going to grow. You're already hearing retailers, and I think on the western side, west central part of the state, there's probably some post applications that are going to probably start this week. Different areas of the state, that's probably 2 weeks off. But we are going to start to kind of see those application rates start running on some Dicamba or Enlist, anything like that. But right now, that is the so going back and recapping, we are going to June 20th. I think Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, and South Dakota are also in there. There's some other state legislatures looking at doing the exact same thing with that. But then it's also with V4. But also, if you're in Illinois, 85-degree forecasted high. Above that, it is a do not spray on Dicamba in Illinois.
All right, KJ. So it seems like there are just a couple of things farmers need to know. They need to know that atmospheric number, that 85-degree temperature, is still in effect, that the date has been pushed up in a number of states to June 12th. But there's also that V4 requirement on corn. Do you think that's going to be more of an issue this year than the date, perhaps?
It very well could be. Yeah, I could tell you probably in our west central part of Illinois, that's further ahead. They got planted right after Easter. it could be very well that it hits V4 before we get to that June 12th. If we get some nice weather and it turns 85 degrees and really warm, those beans are going to start shooting up very quickly. So you need to look there's good pictures out there from different soil scientists of what a V4 stage looks like. 4 leaves, 4 cotyledons. Put that out there, look at there, see where you're at on some of your soybeans. I don't think everybody's going to get the V4. I think they're going to hit June 12th first, but there are definitely locations in state of Illinois, if you got ahead of the planning, that could be V4 before we hit the June 12th cutoff.
Okay, so just a lot for farmers to be aware of. This was sort of a last-minute rule change before the season started. Do you think this sort of shifting around on dicamba is going to sort of change going forward anymore, or is this one of the last things we'll see out of EPA?
I'm not a betting guy, so I won't tell you for sure if I think. The only thing we have said, again, what we said to the EPA and to the manufacturers is if you're going to make a change, make it, in the fall when we have those planning decisions, when we're looking at that, even though it's 6 months ahead of before planning to do it. What I'm more worried about is court decisions. I know some of the manufacturers, looked at maybe at this date and bumping up that they would get around some court cases. I think that's what we're going to be looking at. I don't, again, I'm not betting, but I don't know if EPA is going to make any more changes. I think it could be very much up to the courts to decide. You guys remember a handful of years ago, we were right in the middle spray season, and that court case in Arizona shut everything off. I mean, literally everything off that we couldn't spray. And then we were about a week period of limbo. And we had, attorneys telling us, you need to advise your retailers that it is illegal right now to spray dicamba, how this junction is put out with these court cases. So I think everything right now, I think some of the environmental groups are switching more away from EPA, and it's going to go more court cases. And that can probably drive us into another issue we can talk about is the Endangered Species Act. Right now, how all pesticides are regulated is through FIFRA. That's kind of the National Pesticide Act, or if you know anything about Illinois, it's by the Illinois Pesticide Act. There is tolerances on all pesticides, how the mitigation works and all that. But we are seeing environmental groups go more after not FIFRA, but the Endangered Species Act. Everything that they're getting, if a manufacturer is getting sued on, is now on the Endangered Species Act, because the Endangered Species Act, there's no tolerance. If you are killing, endangered bumblebee or snail or whatever, there's zero tolerance. And so what we're seeing in court cases, and you can hear it in the voices of the manufacturers, that they're more worried about the court cases than actually FIFRA. I think FIFRA lays out a good way how you get something to market, how we kind of know that the legal way of what those labels need to say and go through it. But we're going to really have to deal with the Endangered Species Act, because the two that we're looking at right now is in both corn and soybeans. You have atrazine that's being looked at on some of the Endangered Species Act, but you also have Enlist, that there's mitigations that you have to do before you spray Enlist. And it's not on drift, but it's also mostly on runoff. If it's supposed an inch or a half inch more rain, it's a do not spray on some of those listed products. So I think as farmers and retailers going into the future, we are going to have to be more and more concerned and updated our thoughts on what is going to go with the Endangered Species Act.
That's really interesting, especially with, Enlist being one of those very popular chemical and cropping systems that's out there, that there are additional restrictions there that farmers need to be aware of.
Yeah. And so again, on the list one, it is not, we talk about dicamba and drip. Enlist has no, technically no drip problem, but what they're more worried about is a runoff. We plant, we spray, we're going to get a big rain, and then we're going to have a runoff that gets into a creek that would have that Enlist on that soil. So it's not the same way we think on another product, but we're going to have to really look at this stuff going into the future. And we need to be vigilant of what EPA is doing on the Endangered Species Act.
Are there anything in the courts right now that farmers should be aware of? Is this something that could happen this season, or is this sort of in the next few years, that's the trend in the way that it's going?
I think two core cases, but one EPA. One is the Dicamba. They're still out in the western states. Some lawsuits about that. I think everybody's just kind of watching that inside the pesticide industry. Do I think it's going to happen in the next 2 weeks? No, but I think we have to watch that. I think, and we made comments, and pretty much everybody made comments late last summer on atrazine, the re-review of atrazine. I don't think that review will come out probably until this fall. So I think we get through this season, but we have to watch atrazine very, very heavily. Atrazine is a huge component for spring burn down before corn. And if we don't have atrazine, pretty much any pre-mixture that goes out in a corn herbicide is going to have an atrazine in it. So we're going to have to watch it. So those are your two biggest ones. But the atrazine is more in EPA. But if we're going to look at court cases, look at Dicamba. But I think the environmental groups are going to sue on anything to see where they can break that dam or put a crack in that dam.
That causes some problems, especially since, like with Dicamba a few years ago, it can happen at any time that a court rules and things.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so let's look ahead a little bit at, this summer in the growing season. Sounds like the crop's off to a really good start in Illinois. What's it look like for some of the growing conditions over the summer? What are our farmers going to likely be applying more fungicides, things like that of that nature? What do farmers need to know heading into sort of their heavy agronomy season?
I definitely think farmers are going to look, and I think we're off to a good start. With prices falling, as much as we don't want to say that, guys are going to look at putting that into that crop and putting the best dollar for their buck in there with some of these falling prices. The only thing I will tell farmers, and I've said to my father, to all my friends, last year, we all talked about higher fertilizer prices, higher chemical prices. Yeah, if you go look at some of that stuff, it's just like the corn and soybean prices here recently. It is fallen quickly. What I try and tell people is retailers are seeing that drop in the price of stuff. So if you're going to have a fungicide application, if you're going to side dress 28 or 32%, you need to have a conversation with that retailer or your chemical distributor that, hey, I'm thinking I'm going to need probably about this amount of stuff. This amount of fertilizer, this amount of fungicides, because with everything falling, a 2-week period, it could drop another $10 on some product. We've seen it in Roundup. We've seen it with Liberty. So have a good conversation with your retailer beforehand, because I have had calls of, there's a potash shortage. There's not a potash shortage. Retailers are not taking a position or having everything stocked full, because this is that year where everything's falling off. Everybody, by the end of this cropping season, August 1, they want to pretty much have zero stock of anything. So have good conversation. If you need some more potash, you need some encapsulated urea, don't call the day before you're going to have that application made. Have a good conversation, lead time with that retailer. Say, hey, I'm thinking about this month. Do you think you can get it? Or do you have it in stock? Same thing on chemicals. The one thing I think we need to be really, I think we're in good supply, but just so those retailers have it in place, is the fungicide. That's the biggest one. I know crop is that tall, but what's going to grow quickly. And in a month, we're going to be in the fungicide season. So have that conversation. If you think you're going to have any kind of crop and you're going to put on fungicide, or you're going to put 2 applications, talk with those retailers now that they put that in place to get there. Because, again, talking to every retailer, August 1, they want to see nothing in bins or any supply, just because of how that stuff has fallen, and kind of reset the market of where we're going to be on prices going into the 24 crop, even though we're just getting into the 23 crop.
Well, farmers do think long term, like you said, last fall when you're in the combine, you're already making your seed decisions for the next year and getting ahead of things. I know that come August is when farmers really start thinking like, hey, do I need to pre-book my fertilizer for the next year and whatnot? And so it's really sounds like just planning ahead. It sounds like you're saying there are no real shortages of any chemistries that are out there. You just got to communicate to make sure it's available when you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's any shortage in it. I want to say I don't see any shortage. But again, retailers are not taking a position just to have stock on hand. Mm-hmm. Have a good conversation with them. Give a 2-week window so they can get that in place. So when you're ready to go, it's ready. They'll have that stuff for you to pick up or apply themselves.
Okay. Well, KJ, is there anything we didn't get around to discussing today that you would like to add or have sort of our farmer attendees think about?
The only thing I'll put out there, especially for Illinois, but other states, we talked about court cases on pesticides. Really watch your state general assemblies and watch to see if they have any pesticide-related stuff. What we're seeing is we're not seeing a whole lot of pesticide new regulations on the federal side. There is a couple, but we are seeing those groups go more to the state side to go after different pesticides or different products. Illinois, this is one thing that Illinois has gotten right, but most people don't even know what it is pesticide-free entry. And what that means in Illinois is the state of Illinois regulates all pesticides. What that means is the city of Springfield or the Champaign County cannot ban Roundup or ban Dicamba or, enlist. Make sure your state has it. You need to work with your ag community. Most states do. I think there's 34 out of 50 states do have pesticide-free entry, but that's to protect us. But you're seeing those groups go more kind of, we're going to go after one product from that angle. So it's getting smart. It's not as much on the DC level. There's still stuff going on out there, but we're definitely seeing on the court cases for sure, but on the local level, local state levels where you can see pesticide bans or, cutoffs or something like that. So farmers and retail need to be more vigilant on the state level, just not on the national level.
That's really good for folks to know because at our events, we tend to get folks from across the country, including, out in Oregon and some of that Palouse region. We get a lot of viewers from out there as well and down in the Southeast, and it varies all the way across the country. Well, KJ, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today. I know it's May 15th. You are expecting a baby. I hope all goes well. Congratulations, and thank you for taking the time to visit us.
Okay, thank you. I told the wife that we couldn't have the baby until corn is done planted and beans, and we made it through that. So she held up her end of the bargain. Now I get to see a new baby girl come in hopefully in the next week.
Well, good luck with all of that. We're thinking of you.
Thanks a lot, Katie.
And now we're going to turn our sights to Minnesota, up north. Minnesota has done pretty good with their corn planting so far this year. They're about 80% complete on corn planting. That's right up there with the national average. But on soybeans, they're a little bit behind. They've only got 53% in the ground. And a lot of that has to do with a really big rain event that happened in the early part of this month. I had a chance to visit with Mark Nowak. He's from Wells, Minnesota, last Friday. He's most likely out planting soybeans today. He might be watching if he has the time, but I wanted to give you his insights into what's happening in his part of the world. Well, joining me now is Mark Nowak from Albert Lea, Minnesota. Mark is a frequent contributor to DTN in different ways. You read from him in our Farm Agronomy Advisors group, as well as different aspects here and there. Mark's had a nearly 50-year farming career. He's up in South Central Minnesota. And Mark, welcome to the Ag Summit series.
Well, thank you, Katie. I'm glad we can get together and talk. One correction here. I am from Wells, Minnesota. I'm near Albert Lea. Wells is my hometown.
Thank you for correcting me. Okay. Right. It's easy. I know what it's like when you try and point to the largest small town nearby.
There you go.
How big is Wells?
About 2,800.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit, Mark, about your growing season so far.
Well, let's go back a little bit. I'll go through this real fast. But last fall, we were very dry. And I typically get my anhydrous nitrogen down in the fall. We started for about 2 days. The weather changed. It got cold. I think we got some moisture, and that shut down the season. We had an early onset to winter. And then winter got real, and Christmas weekend, we had a major blizzard, gave us a foot of snow and 4-foot drifts. And then the rest of the winter was interesting. While from southwest Minnesota, which is 150 miles west of here, up through our Twin Cities, they'd get 8, 10, 12, 14 inches of snow. We'd get 2 to 3 inches of snow, but an inch of rain. That happened 3 times. One time we had 1.25 inches of rain and hardly any snow with it. But there was enough snow on the field, and with the shallow frost, all that moisture seeped into the ground, or most of it did. We didn't have any ponding after rain in the middle of winter. And then one thing that makes us farmers really happy, when the melt comes in the spring and we go look at our tile outlets and there's water coming out of the tile outlets, we know we've got moisture down, 3.5, 4 feet. And that was exactly the case. It wasn't just a trickle. It was a nice flow of water. So we were pleased about that we were in good shape. Some of the weather models that I look at and read said we would have a dry and cool early start to spring, which would get us maybe into an early start to planting. And it was very cool the first 10 days, but from the 10th of April through the 14th, we had, I got it written down here, we had 87 growing degree units. One day it was 89 degrees, and we set an all-time record for that date. I think it was the 12th of April. Now, that was perfect for us because we got our anhydrous down in perfect conditions with that warm weather, and the soils were great. A very small handful of guys decided to start planting corn the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th of April, and some of us thought, well, that might be a little early with the season yet. But the ground conditions were good. I think the planters worked well. And then on the 15th of April, it turned cold. I mean, really cold. We had a total then of 28 growing degree units from the 15th of April through the end of the month.
Wow.
Compared to the 87 we had in a 4-day period prior to that. So,
yeah.
I mean, you talk about extremes. So then it warmed up enough that we started planting corn on the 2nd of May. And conditions were ideal. And between myself and my young partner I work with here and his father-in-law, we put in 1,050 acres of corn in 3.5 days. I mean, there was nothing to stop us. Things were good. Conditions were good. The equipment worked well. So we're feeling very good about that. And then the Monday, the 7th of May, we thought we started planting beans, and we're hoping to roll through them. And we got a little bit of rain on Monday, stopped us for a day, went back in the field on Wednesday, would have been the 9th. And the next morning it rained, and it rained for 4 days straight. We had 5.5 to 6 inches of rain in that 4-day period. And we are still now sitting and being delayed by that. And 2 of those rains came with just downpours, fast downpours. We've had ponding in our fields like we haven't seen in a long time. And we're waiting for the soil to dry up enough to maybe resume planting here. I'm thinking maybe next week, early.
Yeah.
With the cool weather we've had, we've also been affected this week by a heavy smoke cover from the forest fires up in Saskatchewan and Alberta. That doesn't help the drying any. It doesn't help the solar radiation for our little corn plants are coming out. They're coming out. They're not the color yet we'd like to see, but that'll take care of itself. So it's been a season of good and all of a sudden not so good. So that's where we're at today. Now today it's cool, cloudy. It feels more like harvest weather at the end of October. It's 50 degrees, windy, cloudy. We're not going to get much drying or growing degree units today, but so that's where we're at, Katie.
Do you see, what's your weather forecast looking like? You said you might be able to get back to planting early next week, which would be Monday, the 22nd and the 23rd, which is when we're going to be airing this segment. You think you'll be back in the field by then, perhaps?
Well, that's our hope right now. The weather for, it's supposed to clear up yet today. Now, with this smoke, yesterday the weather people said sometime Friday, the air systems are going to change and the smoke is going to go. And it did. Air is crystal clear and dry this morning, and then from Saturday through all of next week, it looks like it's supposed to be mostly sunny and a lot of 70-degree temps, and the soil is starting to dry, but it's not fit yet to work. And if we're going to go in a little bit later than we'd like, we want the conditions to be ideal for optimum emergence. So I don't think it's a time to rush anything. We still got enough time, but we want to do it right. So we're optimistic now. The other issue there is, and I was just out this morning, we did have where these ponds were in our cornfields. The corn that was not underwater is up, stands look good, but there's a lot of fields in a big area here that I don't know that this corn is going to emerge through those. I think it suffered. I looked at some of the plants. They're there. They appear to be trying to struggle through, but there's such a muddy crust on top. I don't know if they can push through, but if I get the beans in middle of next week, I'll go back in and flip the planter back to corn and go spot those fields in. I probably got 10, 15 acres. That is very unusual that it would not emerge, but the water came at the wrong time for emergence. And there's just probably in south central Minnesota, there's probably many, many thousands of acres that are affected by that. So we'll see by Monday, Tuesday if it's going to push through to get enough stand, or if we have to go in and spot replant.
I thought it was interesting when you said this winter, you didn't have any ponding when you got those rains because the ground was soft enough to absorb it. But yet this spring you're dealing with the ponding issues. Is that kind of unusual for you up in that area?
Oh, very unusual. Right now, if you drive around and these rains that came, the ground looks beat up. It's packed. It's there's no good color to it, and that's very unusual to see those kind of heavy rains during planting season to pond up that water. I haven't been in my fields to replant any corn probably in, the last 10, 15 years. This is very unusual. This is probably the most corn, if I am faced with replanting these low spots that were underwater that are very dark yet today, they're still not fit to go in and replant. It might be the most I would ever have replanted.
Oh, wow.
Very, very unusual, but it's also, it's going to cost us some bushels. We don't know how much yet, but it will.
That kind of is the big question this year, especially with USDA calling for, a record corn crop. I know it's still early, sort of the record ending stock situation. But to hear that you're having troubles up there in Minnesota with some of that replant potential, that's usually you're in a pretty high producing area. Am I correct in my remembering?
Oh, very good. Yeah. If we don't get 220 bushel corn, we think we've had an off year. But I'll just say this about USDA, and this is an old adage in farming. Your maximum yield potential happens the day you plant the crop. And then after that, what affects it? I said, we planted this corn in ideal conditions, and now we've already taken our first nick to that crop. It's going to cost us some bushels. So I think USDA might have done the same thing. They heard that we were making rapid progress across the Corn Belt. While things look great, they look ideal, but we had our little nick here. Who's going to be next? Will it be drought in the Southwest Corn Belt? Will there be issues in the Eastern Corn Belt? But we'll see how close USDA will come to that 181 and a half bushel yield estimate, which would be an all-time record for the country too. So.
Right. Well, they work off of that trend line, and that's kind of where they start every year before they start adjusting it to where they're going to go. Yeah. Good. What are some of the, you're still working on soybean planting. Is this kind of the typical time for you? When do you want to normally have that complete and that wrapped up?
Well, if I could write the ideal script, I'd like to plant corn 25, 6, 7, 28 of April, flip the planter and be planting beans the first week in May. After the 15th, we feel like we're a little bit too late for optimum yield even on soybeans. Corn for sure up to the 15th of May, but we'll probably give up some yield if we don't get this crop in until the middle of next week. So
okay,
the optimum yield window is probably starting to close pretty fast here.
Okay. Now you work as a consultant, you work with farmers in a wider area of, is it mostly in Minnesota, or do you reach down into some of Iowa too?
Well, I don't do too much in Iowa, but these rain systems, as I watched the radar, basically came into southwest Minnesota, moved along I-90 and towards the Twin Cities, but I do have customers in southwest Minnesota, and they're talking the same thing. I've talked with a couple of them this week. They got maybe a third of their beans in, and they're dealing with the same issues, water and ponding, and some of the news reports. So this is not just an isolated incident to one or two counties here. It's a pretty broad sweep across southern Minnesota that will ultimately show up in probably just a few less bushels going to through the combine this fall.
Well, I hope that this is the only nick that comes your way, but we do know that the growing season is long. There's lots that can happen. Sort of in your experience, what's it going to take to kind of keep this crop moving forward?
Well, now is lots of sun and warm temperatures, but nothing hot, and timely rains. And I follow the weather pretty close, and I knew all about La Nina, that was due to start fading, and now it's confirmed that La Nina has faded. El Nino is coming in. typically El Nino should give us a better growing season than maybe we've had in the last 2-3 years, where there's been some challenging conditions, dryness in some parts and not in others. But I'm still wondering about the transition from La Nina to El Nino, if it's going to give us a full season of ideal growing conditions, if there's going to be some spot challenges because of heat or dryness. Yet we have a family member that farms in northwest Iowa, and they're just looking for rain every day. When we got these heavy rains, they had very little, and they're just hoping for rain. And so there's still some dryness out here, and we're on the other extreme right now.
So anything else on crop conditions before I throw a few different questions your way?
Well, I don't know how many people do this, but we like to spray our beans right after we plant them, and with the, planted for those 2 days, and next thing you know, we got 5-6 inches of rain. We haven't put our pre-emergent soybean herbicide down, and so then we have to start thinking what's our next move with that. So that's a challenge that's got to be decided here in the near term. But other than that, we just hope for a good week ahead and get the rest of the crop in, and then we'll move forward.
So, Mark, I know one of the things you and I talk about a lot is risk management in a couple of different ways, whether that's crop insurance or different hedging strategies. Have you done anything different on those fronts approaching this growing season?
Well, don't get me wrong, I don't want to brag about this, but I was very concerned about the market outlook with everything going on in the world, with inflation, with interest rates, with the Russia-Ukraine thing continuing. I've probably got more 23 crop hedged than I've maybe ever had at this stage of the game. Even with my consulting customers, I said, well, there should be a spring rally of some sort here, and start little and get more aggressive as the spring rally unfolds. But I'm starting to believe we may not have much of a spring rally. The big traders, the big funds have decided they don't want to participate in their risk management, and so they're probably investing their money in the 5, 6, 7% bank rates or U.S. Treasuries, and they're risk off, and so that's showing up in the market as we've had a tremendous slide here. So I've stayed with my typical crop insurance program, 80% multi-peril. I do a yield enhancement program, so with that in hand, if we do have a less yield because of late planting and the prices stay lower than the winter pricing, I mean, there'll be some insurance protection there to keep my cash flow pretty much where I want it to be.
I think that's a question, given this recent, decline in prices, that a lot of farmers are going to have a sort of, when does crop insurance come to play purely from the price perspective, let alone if there's any issues out there with yield. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, I've already started playing with some of those numbers. I mean, we have a $5.93 multi-peril corn price. If that goes to $4.50, we could start collecting insurance with some pretty good yields yet. And those bushels that we may not have get because of weather, we're going to get paid well for those. So this might be the best year we've had in a long time to take advantage of crop insurance. So, but that's something I've advocated for my farming career and my customers, is make sure you keep enough insurance. Don't insure for profit, but insure to manage that risk of the unknown. And we're getting hit with that unknown of a difficult start to the planting and growing season. So.
Yeah, I've never met a farmer that likes growing bushels or farming for crop insurance money. They'd much rather farm for the market and be able to supply the needs of their cash markets that are out there. Mark,
we love the bushels. We love having the bushels, and then we can figure out what to do with them after we get them. So.
Yep. Any other thoughts, Mark, before I let you get back to your day and start thinking about all those big questions about what you're going to do about your herbicides and your weed control this year?
No, I think, I look at, I follow DTN weather as close as most people, or more than most probably, but I get up in the morning, first thing I do is grab a cup of coffee, turn on the computer, and check the local forecast. And woke up this morning, and starting tomorrow through next week, sunny and clear and warm. It's like, okay, we're going to get this thing done.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and talking to us ahead of time. I hope when this airs as part of our Ag Summit series that you're out in the field and you won't be around in your office watching us live. I appreciate all of your time.
I love these little summits you have during the season now, and if it looks like we're in great shape and I don't have to push and worry, I might take a little time off Tuesday morning to join you live too. So,
well, let us know if you are, and if anyone has questions, I'll drop them to you in the chat.
Very good.
All right. Thanks,
Katie.
Mark. Friday, just to catch up on his planting progress. If you have any questions for Mark, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Send me a message on Whova. I'll send him his way and get you back some answers about how things are going in Minnesota. Now, we know Mark has said he's been dealing with a little bit too much water. The gentleman to the left or to the right of me is someone that you may recognize from the pages of DTN PF. This is Russ Quinn. He farms in eastern Nebraska, but he's also one of our staff reporters here. Russ, welcome to the studio.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. I know that you're in a little bit of a different situation than Mark is this year. Tell me a little bit about your conditions this year.
Yeah, it's been dry. I mean, it's not even this year. If you go back to last year, I mean, that's when it really started. And you go back even further, it's that winter before last growing season that was we just didn't have any snow at all. It was dry, and then it just continued on through the growing season. And we kind of thought maybe we were going to pull ourselves out of it this winter because we actually had snow this winter, and it was cold and almost a normal, quote, normal winter. But then since the spring, April and May, eastern Nebraska kind of gets a lot of rain, and we just haven't seen any.
And so you're on this sort of like year and a half of drier, much drier than normal. You're all dry land farming in eastern Nebraska,
yes.
Right? Whereabouts?
Just outside of Omaha. Okay. Originally, we were just about 15 miles west of Omaha, but Omaha's grown that way over the years. And so now we're about 35 miles northwest of Omaha in the rolling hills of eastern Nebraska. And but it's certainly been dry the last couple of years.
So how has your planting season gone?
Well, it's been good as far as getting things done. We have had no rain delays because it has never rained. I shouldn't say never. I mean, when we first started planting corn, that one day it rained. But other than that, that was Weeko Friday. We caught 60 hundredths, and I think the time before that it was about an inch. But pretty much that's been it. And normally this is the time of year that we get a lot of rain. I think it was last year we caught like 4 or 5 inches in one of the weeks in the middle of May, and that's what kept us going until June, July, and then we just never caught any rain the whole rest of the growing season. And if we hadn't caught that 4 or 5 inches, whatever it was that 1 week, we would have been dry even sooner than the middle of June, because normally what happens is July and August are dry, but June isn't dry. But last year, that was what was different about that drought, was that it happened so much earlier.
Mm-hmm. So are you having, has everything emerged? How are things looking in the fields?
The corn looks good, because like I said, we got 60 hundredths, not this Friday, but a week ago Friday, so that was after I think most of our corn was planted, so it got off to a good start. But we finished planting beans, I think it was last Friday, and they're not merging because you just plant it into dust essentially. And I talked to some of our neighbors, and that's what they had said too, in the fact that it's just, I mean, the seeds are starting to emerge, or not emerge, but sprout, but they're just not coming up because there's really no moisture for it to emerge.
Okay, so what are your concerns for this growing season? Is there any rain in this near forecast for you?
Yeah, that's the biggest concern is having moisture. I think the last forecast I had seen was that this whole week was dry, and then I think there was slight chances of rain this weekend, 20-30% chance there was rain, and then the next week after that was dry again. So this is the time, like I said before, this is the time of year we normally get moisture. And if we don't have moisture this time of year, and I know from talking to John Barnick, or not to steal his thunder or anything, but
he will be coming up in just a little bit.
Yeah, then I know that El Nino is supposed to start, and we're supposed to go back to a quote normal weather patterns, but we haven't seen anything close to normal this spring. And then we also have cattle as well, so we have pastures, and they look great now. We haven't turned the cows out. We'll be doing that soon, but it's just so dry that we're not going to have any grow back in the pasture grass, which was a problem last year. And then we start feeding hay in the middle of July, and all of a sudden we don't have any hay this winter, and we had to buy a lot of hay this winter. So,
is the grass good enough for now, or are you still on that hay?
The cows are still on hay, but in the next couple of days we'll be turning them out into grass, and then we'll be okay for a month or two. But if it doesn't rain, I mean, that's what we rotational graze, where we go through all the different paddocks of pasture, and then by the time they get back to the first one, they've sat for a month or whatever, and then has gotten some good growth on it. But it only works if it rains. I mean, because if it doesn't rain, the grass doesn't grow. It's pretty simple.
Okay, so how are you feeling about this growing season? What's your are you optimistic?
Feeling?
What's your gut feeling? Yeah.
Well, I think I was more optimistic last year because we had that rain in the middle of May or whatever it was, and then the first part of June we caught some rains. But then after that, then we didn't catch anything in July and August. And some years that's how it is. And then you catch that one rain in July or August, maybe the inch at the middle of June, and it seems like the county fair time. Our county fair is always the last part of June, and we always seem to catch rain during the county fair because you don't want rain that particular time.
Right.
That's when you're going to get it. But this year we're going to have to even get to that point first, and maybe I'm nervous Nelly and not and we're going to get to that point, but I don't know. It's extremely dry for this time of year in eastern Nebraska, western Iowa.
Well, I really hope that Mother Nature throws you a bone here soon, that John and the weather forecast for us next week is wrong, and we get some rains.
That would certainly be nice.
Yeah, we'll have to see what John says a little later on today. He'll be joining us at about 10:30 for his weather forecast. Thank you so much for Russ. Russ, for joining us in the studio. I'm always happy to have good conversations with Russ over here. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please feel free to get yourself a cup of coffee, have any conversations you need to have. We'll come back at about 10 after 10, and we're going to have another conversation with Luke Garrabrant. He's a farmer from Ohio, just outside of the Columbus area, about how his planting season is going. We'll see you soon. Welcome back to the DTN Ag Summit Series, Crop Updates from the Field. I'm Farm Business Editor Katie Dehlinger. Joining me on set right now is our Crops Technology Editor, Pam Smith. Pam, welcome.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here. Pam lives in Decatur, Illinois, so she lives in the heart of corn country. Pam, how are things looking out your way?
Really pretty good. We got in the field fairly early, and we had a little bit of a cold snap in May that slowed the growth down a little bit, but now you can go out to the field and almost see it growing right in front of your face.
That's kind of what farmers like to hear this time of year, that it's up and it's growing and it's going fast.
Right.
Have there been any issues or struggles out that way? Questions, concerns?
We've been dry off and on, but then about the time we get nervous, we've gotten a little shower, or actually an inch or more, which is good. And we did have the dust storms that everybody reported earlier, so that's been that was something that came across, and we're just I think though everything is you can row the crop. Very few fields that are empty. Almost everything's planted.
Okay, well that's something that you really do like to hear in central Illinois. Now I want to ask you another question here. You write one of my favorite features that we do here at DTN. It's called View from the Cab.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so each year we pick two farmers from differing regions to give almost a diary kind of report each week, and I talk to them at least once a week. Actually, we exchange notes almost all the time through the week, but this year reporting from Northwest Missouri and Southeast North Dakota. So actually they're almost up and down from each other, but very different regional climate conditions.
Very interesting, that spread between Missouri and North Dakota.
Right, right.
And they also have some interesting professional careers in addition to farming.
This year it's really interesting because we have some young farmers that applied to be part of this program, and each one of the different farmers have also a full-time job. One is a teacher at a college in precision agriculture, and the other is an ag loan officer at a local bank.
So I know you visit with these farmers every week, so it must be tough when the season's over that you don't get to talk to those folks anymore.
It is, except we continue to talk to each other. And I'm really fortunate that we have a group we call our Farmer Advisory Panel, or we change the name off and on, but we talk to them and they advise us on a lot of different things as to our coverage and agronomy coverage, and so we keep in touch with most of them.
And you got a chance to catch up with one of them last week for this program, Luke Garrabrant from Johnstown, Ohio.
That's right.
Yep.
And they're expecting a baby any day, so that's pretty exciting.
Our second one of this program.
That's right.
Babies and crops.
That's right.
All right, well, let's take a minute and show you Pam's conversation with Luke.
Hi, I'm Pam Smith, the Crops Technology Editor with DTN and Progressive Farmer, and I'm with Luke Garrabrant from Johnstown, Ohio. We're talking crops today, and Luke, give me an idea of what your planting conditions have been like this year.
It seems like our typical early to mid-May window happened in the first couple weeks of April this year. We turned off really dry and really warm there around the start of the second week of April, and had a good 10-day to 2-week stretch there. And then here for the past couple weeks in the start of May, we've been pretty cool and damp, and things have kind of been on a standstill here until about the last week. There has been some planting progress made, but very little.
Okay. So Luke was one of our View from the Cab farmers last year, a regular feature that we have on DTN. And so we followed you every week throughout the planting season and growing season last year. How would you compare this year to last year?
So far, I would say maybe we're a hair drier. We're still too wet to be in the field, but we're not as waterlogged, I guess, as we have been. We got a window there in April to do, quite a bit of field work there around the 15th that we didn't have last year, as I recall. Last year, as I remember, we didn't really get to do anything in the field until May 1st. And then kind of all of spring happened within that May, the month of May. And then it even kind of continued into June last year. Still optimistic that we're going to have a little better outcome this year compared to last, but there are some similarities.
So did you plant corn or soybeans first this year?
Soybeans. I did. Planted soybeans. Haven't gotten the opportunity to plant any corn yet.
Okay. And that is a change for you, I think, if I remember correctly. You were, that's a little earlier than you usually plant soybeans?
Yeah, so kind of growing up, it was always pounded in my head that soybeans are the crop you've got a baby, and you don't dare plant them early and into the potential for frost or anything like that. And it seems like as years have gone on and technology has improved and we've learned more about the crop, it seems like it's totally opposite. And now you get a window of dry weather and soil conditions are fit, throw the rest of it out the window and put them in the ground. And kind of was hesitant to try that. And last year, Dad tried it on a small scale and had success with it, and neighbors have had success with it. And this year, the window of opportunity was too good to pass up. And I ended up planting all of my beans in that mid-April window there during the dry weather.
Okay, so how do they look?
So far, so good. Very slow to emerge. They were put through the ringer, for lack of better words. We turned off really cold and really wet after they were planted. They're around the 22nd of April, and several nights of 30-degree nighttime lows. They were rained on, sleeted on, snowed on. They had a little bit of everything along the way, but they stayed in the ground until we got into the month of May, and so we avoided all the frost, issues that could have came. Things are looking fairly decent so far. Optimistic about it.
Great. So last year you kind of changed up some of your practices just because you got into some tight windows, as I recall, and you were really stretched. Labor was an issue, and so tell us a little bit about what you did and what you changed or what you gave up.
Yeah, so from last year to this year, I guess the major notable changes are I will no longer be making hay this year, which I was doing quite a bit of last year, and I've been able to fortunately grow my crop acres quite a bit. So I've definitely changed my equipment lineup. I went from a 15-foot bean drill to now I'm planting beans with a 40-foot splitter planter. I've added fertilizer to my corn planter. Labor is still one thing I'm trying to navigate. With the loss of hay, that kind of changes the demand for labor, but also adding acres has kind of increased that demand. So I'm right on that awkward point of growth where you need some help, but you can't necessarily justify it from a budget standpoint. So that's something I'm still navigating. But those are kind of the major changes from this year, between this year and last year.
And did you give up? Do you still have wheat, or is that
no wheat this year?
Okay,
with
all right.
Corn and soybeans.
So were those changes made to try to open windows to do other operations, or why did you make those decisions?
Yeah, so weather played a part in it. Just lack of time to get prepared, it seemed like, played a part in it. It just seemed like as soon as one thing was done, we were immediately leading into the next thing. But, between making hay and then fall harvest and then wintertime projects and spring planting, it just seemed like we were stretched so thin trying to, I guess, prepare for each of those seasons and then wrap them up. And I felt that kind of all of the different crops that I was growing were suffering to some extent. So the hay was kind of the easy one to let go of, and I'm hoping to take that time that I have and really focus on pushing, the quality of crop as far as corn and soybeans, doing a better job with them, doing more in-season scouting, tissue testing, utilizing data from that to do in-season applications that I wouldn't have necessarily had time for last year. So really just trying to focus on spring crops and maximize the return on them.
Okay. So still have all the corn to put in. Yep. And when do you start getting nervous?
I'm there. All things considered, I'm there. But kind of really got to see what the capacity of my bean planter was, and corn planter is also 40 foot. And as long as things work well and things go semi-smoothly, I should have no issues getting my corn crop planted in 4 to 5 days of long good days, no issues, no breakdowns, things going smoothly. So it looks like that window could be coming up here the rest of this week and the next, but how quickly things can change.
Also a baby coming this coming week. So
what's today's date? Is it the 16th?
Yep.
So 9 days now. 9 days is the induction date for baby number
Okay.
2. So kind of a lot of pressure right now.
So let's get this baby crop up too.
Yes, no doubt.
All right. So optimistic, lukewarm. What's your view of this season?
Assuming the core crop goes in the next 10 days, 2 weeks, I hold out optimistic for the corn crop. Beans, I think everything's off to a good start. I hope we get good weather through the growing season because, especially today, seeing what the markets are doing, it's going to take a good crop to balance out, overall gross income per acre. Markets are down, so pessimistic about markets, optimistic about the actual crop itself.
All right. Well, we got our fingers crossed for you and the baby and the crop.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Luke.
Yep.
All right, that was Luke Garrabrant from Johnstown, Ohio. Now, I looked at the USDA crop progress report. It looks like Ohio 66% planted on corn and about 63% planted on soybeans. We'll have to see what those numbers look like next week. Maybe we'll give us an idea how Luke gets in with that corn planting in this space. Well, we're also still on baby watch for him. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we move on with the rest of our agenda. We've got a special session at the end of today. We've got our weather outlook, our grain market outlook, and then we've got what we're calling a Zoom coffee shop. We've been talking a lot about crop conditions in different parts of the country today, and we know that we have viewers and attendees on from all over the country. So if you've got a little bit of extra time before you have to get to your lunch plans, whatever for the day, please feel free to log into that Zoom, share, talk, listen. There is a link for that in the agenda session. There's also a link for it in the community discussion board area. Just look for the meetup and the link is in there for that. That'll be on Zoom. You can click on it through the Whova platform, but it's not done through this same program. So we're going to move on to our next presenter today. This is someone who's got a lot to say about what's going to happen this summer. DTN ag meteorologist John Barnick. John, he's joining us from our Burnsville, Minnesota office. Well, nice to have you.
Yeah, good to talk to you again, Katie. I couldn't come down there to Omaha because I just cannot pass up this kind of weather. 70s and 80s in Minnesota in May is just fantastic. So had to be up here for that.
I totally understand that. You've got a couple young kids yourself, and when you can kick them outside and sit and watch them in pleasant weather, you got to take advantage.
That's right. Sit back in the sunshine or in the shade if you're got a gazebo or a porch or something, and just watch them play and just relax and enjoy the weather because you know it's going to turn around at some point.
Because that's what you do, and you're a meteorologist. John, tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about today, and then take it away.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of recap what went on through the spring. We'll kind of give an update on where we sit. We'll take a look at the summer season, how that's looking, an update on El Nino, and what the fall might be coming up as well. So we'll kind of go through the rest of the season here, kind of give us all an update on where we're sitting, where we're headed. And I'll also be talking about Canada, too. So I know we had some questions last time back in February about that, so I made sure to add that to the presentation this time. So let me share my presentation here and we'll get started. So we'll just get right on with it. There we go. So over the spring season, we did kind of have an extended winter period there, at least through about mid-April, especially if you were in the northern plains. It took almost forever to really get rid of the snowpack there in North Dakota, and we've seen the results of that with the delayed planting we've had here. That continues to be the case. A little bit wet up there as well. But we've had other issues kind of sporadically. Luke just talked about some of the frost he had there in Ohio earlier this month, and that's kind of been the case across some of the northern areas here this month. But for the most part, now that we've gotten into May here, we've kind of really flipped the tables and we've seen some warmth. But basically we set up here to kind of look a lot like the winter on the left there, with the cold pocket there across the northern plains and then the warmth there across the eastern half of the country. As far as precipitation was concerned, we were pretty active but we had some dry pockets as well. The northern plains got plenty of precipitation, some of that in the form of snow, unfortunately, which kind of let things meander just a little bit there for the first half of the spring season. If we kind of go a little bit more granular, though, instead of just kind of smoothed out, what we really saw was a lot of precipitation in a lot of places. So right there on the left is our last 90 days, updated yesterday. And we can see a lot there in the western states. Their active winter season continued throughout the spring. But we also saw some heavier precipitation events in the northern plains through the upper Midwest, kind of in the Ozarks, Arkansas area, also down in parts of Texas. You might notice that we did have a continued dry period in eastern Nebraska through central Missouri back down through West Texas. For the most part, I mean, we had some heavier rainfall events there over the last couple of weeks, but if you kind of average that out over the 90-day period, we were dry for a long time before that. So we're still a little bit on the dry side. If you look at the last 2 weeks, though, you can see it's been very active in the plains, and we've seen some significant drought reduction because of it. A lot of areas around the country really have seen some pretty decent rainfall over the last couple of weeks. So if we look at the drought monitor, on the left is where I left you 3 months ago, back in late February. We had some reduced drought in the western states, but it maintained itself in the plains. But if you look at the right there, how far we've come, I mean, basically the western drought is almost completely gone. And the plains drought has seen some better improvements here over the last couple of weeks. Not significantly, as if we go to the kind of the change over the last 12 weeks, or basically since I left you again, you can see just in the green there how much improvement we've seen in that drought coverage across so much of the western half of the country. Again, we've seen a little bit of degradation in some places that stayed a little bit drier, notably that eastern Nebraska through central Missouri back down to the West Texas area. But for the most part here, even that has been improving recently. So it was a little bit worse a couple of weeks ago. And we can really see those changes there in the soil moisture. So we're looking at the top 100 centimeters or 40 inches of soil moisture here. Again, this is where I left you back in February, and we were dealing with kind of dryness across a lot of areas. A lot of these areas up here in the upper Midwest were covered in snow, so that played a part in it. But after we melted all the snow, and we got a bunch of rain. The latest update here, which I see this is from 5 days ago, but even still, most of the country here is still doing pretty good on soil moisture. There are some pockets. Again, it's the eastern Nebraska through central Missouri back to the West Texas that have some issues. But outside of that area, and maybe a couple of spots there in the Midwest, the eastern half of the Midwest, we're sitting in a pretty good spot for most of us to start, as most of us have seed in the ground. So let's take a look at El Nino. It's going to be the biggest driver of weather here going forward. We've kind of gone from the steady state La Nina for 2.5 years. We finally got rid of that back in February and March. They finally called that, I think March 9th was the last date of technically being in La Nina. We've been cruising through neutral, and we're right on the cusp of El Nino now. I'll have a story out later today kind of discussing this a little bit more in detail, but we are looking at El Nino conditions here coming up. We're very close to it right now, and the forecast here from the American CFS model has us getting into a pretty strong El Nino here as we get into late fall and into early winter. Once you get above this 2 degrees Celsius line here, that's what we commonly refer to as a super El Nino. So not just a regular old El Nino, not even a strong one. This one would be a super El Nino being forecast by this model. And it has been doing this for the past couple of months, by the way. If we look at some other forecasts from around the world, they all show us getting into El Nino, which shouldn't be a surprise since we're right on the cusp of it. But if we look at kind of the intensity, there's quite a spread here amongst some of the more global models. Just picking out a couple of them, though, that are a little bit more important one. This one that's way up here is actually the Australian model. And between the Americans and the Australians, we're kind of the authorities. The two centers are the authorities on El Nino. And so both our forecast here in the U.S. and the one down in Australia is pointing towards a very strong El Nino here come this fall. So you have to keep that in mind. But even some of the European models are a little bit weaker, maybe more in the 1.5 to 2 inch degree range, not inch range. But it's a lot of these forecasts here, especially what are called the dynamical models instead of the statistical ones. We don't need to get technical here, but a lot of the ones that like I would use as the American model, the European model, the Australian model, they all have us getting into this really strong here, this green thick line here, getting into El Nino conditions here, very strong towards the end of the year. So that's coming, and we're almost there. Like I mentioned, the way we kind of look at it is this box here, this 3.4 region here in the Pacific Ocean. It looks like a really small box, but it's a wide area of ocean out there in the tropical Pacific. Once we get above that 0.5 degree line, we're in El Nino, but we have to do it consistently for a couple of months. So it's going to take a little bit of time yet, but we're right on the cusp of it, right there at that 0.5. You can see how we've really improved or really warmed up the ocean here in each of these regions over the last few months, and we're right on the edge of it. So we'll be heading there pretty soon. If we look at kind of where temperatures are right now in those anomalies, that box is what we're looking at to be kind of official. And you can see we're warm, but not as warm as those waters off the coast of South America. Those have been really, really warm here over the last several months. And what has been a little bit different, kind of holding back El Nino so far, has been the cooler temperatures off the coast of California and Mexico. These developed off that really active winter and springtime pattern that brought all that precipitation into California. Talked about atmospheric rivers, all the flooding, all the snowfall, and it really cooled down the waters there. Well, those have been bleeding into the central Pacific Ocean and kind of cooling down or tempering the warming a bit. Otherwise, we would have been solidly in El Nino already. What you can notice, though, is all these warm waters up in the northern Pacific are starting to move their way into that region and erode that away. So once this happens, we should expect El Nino to really kick up in intensity here going into summer and definitely the fall. So with that in mind and El Nino coming into fruition, we have to make note, though, that El Nino does take some time to really develop and for the atmosphere to respond to those conditions. So it'll take some time. But if we look at history, what we seem to think, or actually I'll get that to that in just a second, because I'll go over some of those. What we're looking at here is if you average it up every day between June 1st and August 31st, what would the conditions be like? So it's a very broad average. Really, we see a good signal for warmth in the western states, especially the Pacific Northwest and up into Western Canada. And I'll talk about Canada in a minute as well. But not a huge signal for either warmth or coolness across the middle of the country. We should see a lot of variability throughout the course of the summer season. We will still get hot streaks and some heat waves in there, but for the most part, those are likely to be short-lived and kind of be interspersed with some more periods of coolness too. We didn't see that the last couple of summers due to La Nina. Hopefully, we'll get some better temperatures with that as well. So that's not really a change from what I told you about 3 months ago. And so that forecast is largely on track. As far as precipitation is concerned, we have this set up here, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's heavily front loaded. Now that we're in the very end of May here, the June forecast is heavily weighted by the 15-day forecast now that it's getting well into June. So this is kind of heavily June focused instead of the rest of the month. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But if we look back in history, we at DTN, we take analogs, we take kind of years that look like years in history that look like what the conditions we're seeing now. So ENSO goes into that, El Nino goes into that. So we're trying to pick out years that went from a La Nina to an El Nino. There weren't very many of them, not that matched the same situation as the temperatures out in the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic as well. So we're trying to put all those together and come up with a good idea of what summer might bring us. And if we look at our top 4 analogs here, you can see the two on the left, and we're looking at temperatures here. Two on the left were El Ninos, but they were somewhat weak, so they would kind of more align with some of those international models. The two on the right were super El Ninos, 2015 and 1997. And those are more in line with the Australian and the American models. So we've kind of got a mixture of both kind of competing here. And what we can notice for the most part, and especially if we get into the super El Nino, is that much of the Corn Belt honestly stays either near or a little bit cooler than normal. If we go out to kind of a weaker El Nino, we kind of get a mix of temperatures. So 1 year here, this was 1951, which was, I understand, was a really long time ago, but even our long-range forecasters are pretty impressed by kind of the same kind of trajectory that 1951 took to 2023. But 2006 was another one that ended up to be kind of a hotter year, kind of more La Nina looking like there for the summertime period, just in terms of temperatures. But if you take those three out of four there are pointing us to some cooler conditions. So we're still on track for, I think, a quote normal summer. If anything, I would lean a little bit on the cooler side, maybe not as warm as that 2006 model. If we look at precipitation, though, it doesn't really seem to matter whether or not we're talking about a weaker El Nino or a stronger El Nino. We're looking at precipitation that's pretty darn good across much of the country. We've already seen that kind of in different parts of the country here over the course of the last several months. It used to be in the West and then in the eastern Midwest here in early spring. It's migrated kind of to the plains here for late spring and early summer. But we should see those kind of moving around a bit. You'll notice that, it doesn't seem to matter which year. There's pockets of wetness, there's pockets of dryness, and they don't really seem to have a method to them. So that's just telling me that we're going to have kind of a normal summertime pattern. I mentioned this about 3 months ago. That forecast, I think, still holds up. So we should see thunderstorms developing out in the plains, moving their way eastward, kind of building as they do for the most part. This week and next week notwithstanding, but we've got some pretty good potential there for getting decent rainfall over a widespread areas of the country. It's going to be unfortunate that some of these pockets of dryness are likely to show up, just depending on where those thunderstorms actually develop and where they track. So that's kind of the ebb and flow of a normal summertime season anyway. The hard thing as a meteorologist is that we don't really get a really good idea of where those pockets really set themselves up. So we're just kind of have to play it by ear on, that 2-3 week forecast about what those conditions might look like. So if we do kind of break this down month by month, June, July, August, again, what we see is kind of this pattern we've been in for the last couple of weeks. It's been a little bit cooler in the plains because of plenty of shower activity, generally warm elsewhere, except for pretty warm in the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. And again, I'll talk about that after we're done with the U.S. For July and August, kind of the same idea. If anything, they're both models and history is kind of pointing us to a warmer than normal northern plains. Might not exactly match that like it's shown here, but needless to say, overall doesn't look too overly concerning with temperatures throughout the plains. I think, if we look at some of those drought areas down there from Kansas and Nebraska southward, that might be more of an issue if the rains don't come. And if we do look at the rainfall here, again, June is heavily weighted on the near-term forecast. And if you've been paying attention to the near-term forecast, we've got plenty of showers lighting up the plains here over the next couple of weeks. They don't really make it far enough eastward into the Midwest or the Southeast on most model predictions. Now, models during the summertime don't really handle convection too well, especially with these kind of pop-up showers and thunderstorms that we're expecting in the plains, and how those might evolve into thunderstorm clusters and move eastward is still to be determined. So this does look concerning now, but we do have overall fairly good soil moisture in the eastern half of the Midwest. So I'm not 100% concerned right now. If this does persist, though, kind of into the middle of June, and certainly into late June, then I'd be a little bit more concerned about the dryness here that's showing up. But if we look at July and August, what I see a lot is a lot of variability, and that just goes to the normal process of showers and thunderstorms over the course of the summer season. So overall, outside of some dry pockets picking up, and we might be starting to see a pocket of that. Of course, these are our ice states, and that would be not a good spot to start building any drought or dryness issues. Outside of that, in the near term, overall, I think the summer still looks like it's on track for a pretty decent summer. So if we take all that into account, El Nino is developing. It's going to take some time, though, for that to really produce its base state. So all these other little factors, the soil moisture that's already there, some other subseasonal factors, thunderstorm clusters that are moving around the equator. I've talked about that several times. Soil moisture that's going on right now, the drought reduction that's been helped out in the plains. All these things are going to really impact the summer season, but it's going to do it in somewhat of an unpredictable way, a more localized way. So we're going to have to kind of take that with time. So uncertain temperature pattern, but slightly cooler than the model suggests. Models tend to be a little on the warm side anyway, and history kind of tends us to lead us into some better forecasts for that. But I think we're still, again, optimistic for a normal summertime pattern. There are going to be winners and losers, and it's going to be hard to determine. Hopefully, we'll get some more rainfall in those drought areas. It's been tough to get rid of in the plains. We've seen some improvement over the last couple of weeks, but and we've got a little bit more coming up in the short term. Whether or not that really is enough to really eat away at that core drought that's been there for the last 2-3 years, that's going to be tough to do. It's going to take probably into the fall and especially winter seasons to really erode all that away. But, even if we do have drought in place, as long as we get some normal type precipitation, I'm not overly concerned about the plains either. It would be if we get some of those dry stretches that drought can really have a more pronounced effect. So it might be a little bit more touch and go for the plains than other areas of the country, but overall, I still think we're pretty good. So if we look at history then, and we look at some trends here, I've circled the years that we're using in our analogs, 97, 2006, and 2015, includes those two Super Nino years on the bookends of it. And overall, trendline yields seem to be pretty good. Now, of course, those are following some different types of years. 2014 actually ended up as kind of a neutral heading into an El Nino year. So that's a little different. 2005 into 6 was a little different as well. None of these really show up to be an exact match. And you shouldn't say just because we're headed to an El Nino means we can expect El Nino conditions. Every single El Nino is going to be different. And so the conditions that we see this year are likely to be different from these. But, historically, we end up with pretty decent yields on a national basis, not necessarily on a local basis. Going into the fall season, again, if we look this kind of holistically, temperatures, we don't see a huge swing pattern if you take the season as a whole. And precipitation ends up being okay. We obviously the front end of the season, we don't want a whole lot of rain, or we'd like a little bit more rain than the back half so we don't interrupt our harvest. But overall, this isn't such a bad look. But it's when we take that kind of month by month that we start to see some noticeable differences. And so September really looks like just another summer month where we have some variable temperatures. But once we get into October and November, we're starting to see some cool pockets here. And that might be a little bit concerning. But I will say that these weaker El Ninos that I've been talking about, 2006 and 1951, those ones ended up with some cooler fall temperatures, but those weren't the Super Ninos. And if the forecasts do trend towards those Super El Ninos, 97 and 2015 were both pretty warm. 2015 especially set a bunch of records across the upper Midwest for heat. So I'm a little skeptical about the fall forecast in terms of temperatures. But what we have seen, either weak El Nino or strong El Nino, Super Ninos, the precipitation actually ends up pretty variable too. So much like the summertime, we end up with pretty decent precipitation. The October one might be a little bit more exaggerated because if we go back to the temperatures, this clash between the cold air up in up in the upper Midwest, the northern plains, and the warmth in the southeast is where storm systems love to track. We also had a couple of hurricanes move through that are kind of enhancing the precipitation here in our analogs. So that's something to note too. Hurricane season during an El Niños typically have lower amounts of tropical storms. It doesn't mean they don't happen, and it doesn't mean that it can't affect the U.S., and doesn't mean they can't affect the U.S. significantly. We do have a forecast here at DTN of being below the average, but a couple of these could be kind of close developing ones. Sometimes we get these fronts that'll set up off the coast of the Gulf Coast in the southeast, and we'll see little tropical systems develop off of those and move into the U.S. Those have happened before. We're looking at that potentially for this week too. Not necessarily tropical, it could be subtropical or just a low pressure system, but that's one of these things that can muck up things, is the tropical weather. And that's nearly impossible to kind of try and predict at this point in time. So that's kind of how we're looking through the fall. As we look just a glimpse into a winter and what does El Nino really mean? What does it really do? And it really splits our jet stream. So normally Pacific jet comes in, it usually goes up or down, but during El Nino, it splits. We get one kind of going way up through Alaska and Northwest Canada, coming down across Eastern Canada and into the Northeast. Usually ends up with a cooler air here over Eastern Canada, and warm conditions south of it through the Canadian prairies and through much of the middle of the country. The southern end of that jet stream usually just trucks right on through the southern end of the country, and we end up with wetter conditions from California all the way to the Carolinas. Intermixed with that, though, without these systems really coming down from a good perspective, getting going, some of these clipper systems or other systems coming down from Canada. It tends to be a little bit drier here in the Ohio Valley and the Tennessee Valley. You don't really see much of a change in precipitation across the northern plains or Canada, though. But that's just a kind of an update of what El Nino kind of tends to be during the winter season. These wetter conditions here in the southern plains tend to help out those areas, even all the way up to Kansas or perhaps Nebraska as well. So hopefully some of these areas that are in drought, we'll see that erode over the winter time. So I kind of went over this already. We're looking at El Nino taking control, especially late. And it could be headed towards a super El Nino. If we are, we're likely to be warmer than what our forecast here is showing. But if it's not, and it does tend to be weaker, we might have a shorter growing season. That might be a little bit of a concern for anybody that got planted late. And I'm looking at kind of North Dakota and Michigan, Ohio, some of those areas that were a little bit later planting corn and soybeans this year. We might have to be a little bit concerned about some colder temperatures coming in October, but that's kind of a ways away, and we don't have a whole lot of confidence in that forecast right now. Hopefully that drought reduction continues there in the southern plains. So I mentioned we were going to talk about Canada, kind of the similar way we're going to look at Canada as we did the U.S., first starting out with the drought. And we've had drought here in Canada, in the prairies, going on 2 years, a lot like the plains. It's been much improved, though, over the last few months in some areas. Some areas have gotten a little bit worse, while others have improved. But for the most part, we're sitting in a better spot now than we were at the end of the year. Over the last couple of weeks, though, hasn't been so much. If we look all the way back to April 1st, a lot of these areas in orange and red are well below normal, below like 60% or less of normal precipitation in some of these areas. Down towards the U.S. border, it's been a lot better, especially in southeast Saskatchewan, has been well above normal. But we've been a little bit drier there over the last, since April 1st, really. And if you look at over the last couple of weeks here, kind of similar look to everything. This does not include the precipitation that is ongoing right now and has occurred since yesterday. This is all the way through Sunday, so we've gotten some heavier rain over northern Alberta. That's helped some of the wildfire situation up there, help fighting that and increase soil moisture. And we will be seeing some decent precipitation here in Saskatchewan later this week. So hopefully this turns around a little bit. But if we look at the summer forecast, while the U.S. didn't have a huge signal either way, unfortunately, it does look a little warmer for Western Canada, especially for British Columbia and Alberta. The further east you go, the more variable that tends to be. In terms of precipitation, though, hopefully this works out. We do usually see pockets of drought kind of picking up in spots in there. It'll be difficult to kind of pinpoint where. But overall, we've got drought in the area. We don't have a good signal of getting rid of that during the summertime, so we're going to be dealing with that through the season. As we get into the fall, though, it's a little bit more variable, and I'm not going to go month by month just to respect everybody's time. But again, this is the situation where the stronger El Niños are much warmer here in Western Canada, much like the U.S. So hopefully we end up towards a super El Niño, a stronger one, and it kind of extends the growing season a bit. Along with that, we don't really have a good signal either way of above or below normal precipitation either. So Canada ends up being kind of neutral, one of these areas where if we've got drought, we might have some issues. We may see drought developing in some areas and reducing in some other areas. So kind of a mixed bag as we transition to El Niño this year. Again, I want to remind you about what El Niño does in the wintertime. Keeps the Canadian prairies pretty warm, to be honest. It doesn't mean we're not going to see any shots of cold Arctic air move through, but they'll be shorter than the warmer periods on average. And precipitation, again, doesn't really have a huge positive or negative signal in there. So hopefully if there are some areas of drought, we see some decent enough precipitation, some good snow. Well, maybe not snowpack if we're super warm, but some good precipitation to really get that into the soil structure over the course of the winter and get us out of this persistent drought pattern we've been talking about from Canada all the way through Texas here over the last few years. So that's all I had for you. If you've got any comments or questions now, I'd love to hear them. I'll be on at that coffee chat too, coming up at 11:30. We can always ask questions there as well. So I'll take them if you have them.
Great. Thank you, John. If you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen so we can see your face, we'd appreciate that. And then we've got a couple questions for you, but if anyone who's watching right now has any, you can drop them in the Q&A on our program here. So you can go ahead and do that. First of all, let's see. You talked a lot about El Niño versus Super El Niño. Can you tell me a little bit more? What's the easy way to remember or kind of gauge the difference between the two? What do we need to know?
Well, there's not a significant classification for a Super El Niño. It's kind of something that we don't have a huge record of El Niños to begin with, and we've only got maybe 4 super El Niños that have been kind of classified as that greater than 2 degrees Celsius above the normal. So we don't have a whole lot to choose from. And so we're still learning about that. And history has really been, the best way we can learn about it because it's hard to trust models several months out when these conditions are so rare. So if we look back at 1997, or if we look at 2015, the biggest difference to really note is how often we see those normal base dates. So I show that picture for usually what El Niño does in the winter with a split jet stream, one going up north through Canada and the other one kind of cruising along south through the southern U.S. During a super El Niño, those would be more of a base date. Those would be more constant. Then some of these, it doesn't always stay in that state all the time. Even through La Nina, we had, even the strong parts of La Nina, we had situations where the atmosphere didn't really look like La Nina. And this past winter was kind of a good example of that. But, in a super El Nino, you would more likely expect that base state to really be in place there for a longer periods of time than with kind of these weaker it's hard to say weaker because even the lower forecasts are still pretty decently strong El Niños. But the stronger the El Niño, the more likely we are to be in that El Niño base state throughout the course of a long period of time.
Okay, good answer to that one, John. Something a little more recent that we've seen in a lot of places in the Midwest, even down into Tennessee where I live, we've seen remnants of that wildfire smoke from Canada. Does that have, what's kind of spurs that you can see wildfire smoke that far away and through the atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a big concentration of wildfire smoke, so large wildfires or many of them in an area to really kind of capture that and bring it over large areas of the continent. Right now, I think, I didn't look at the recent numbers, but the wildfires in Alberta have been very significant. They've been burning thousands upon millions of acres, and all that smoke in the atmosphere goes somewhere. And, a lot of the flow over the United States is from the west or northwest. So when those winds come out of the northwest and when they come from Canada, that tends to bring them, sweep them right down into the northern U.S. So, it's been making for some pretty sunsets. I know people that have some allergies or sensitivity to air pollution have had some struggles with it. But in terms of affecting crop growth, they're still trying to study that and see if there is a significant effect. There's some competing things, positive and negative, to crop growth. And so I honestly, unless you're dealing with it personally, I wouldn't be too concerned about that affecting your crops this year. But if you've got livestock, that might be a different story. And for anybody up there in Northwest Canada, you might have a better feeling of how that affects livestock than we might here in the U.S., where we've had kind of just more of hazy skies and some pretty sunsets. But those really main concern there is to animals instead of plants.
For that clarification. So one of the things when you were giving your summer forecast and looking at it, I know that, or I understand that traditionally La Niñas are sort of hot and dry summers during that pollination period for corn. What's it really looking like this year with the El Niño? And I couldn't help but notice that August precipitation chart and what that could mean for beans.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't take a whole lot of stock in the exact look of those maps, just because a lot of things are going into it that are kind of conflicting and might not turn out that way. Usually with El Niño, and doesn't really affect the U.S. during the summertime period. It's really the late fall and winter where it's the most settled in and has the biggest impact. But that does depend on how quickly we get into El Niño conditions. So, we're not getting into it here the rest of this month. We've only got about 10 days left. But likely in June, I would expect either the Climate Prediction Center or the Bureau of Meteorology to start raising the flag, say, hey, we're in El Niño now. But even then, we don't really see that impact until later summer, maybe August, if it's really strong quickly, or most likely the fall. So I would expect still a lot of variability in the weather patterns throughout the course of the entire summer. Whether or not we get some heat waves at those critical times in July, that might be a little concerning there. And whether or not it'll be real nice and super wet during August, I'm not 100% sold on that either, and not exactly in the places where it's at. So, I would just suggest that it's going to be a pretty variable summer, and hopefully all the rains catch you at the right time. And if you do get into a dry spell, it's on the heels of some pretty good weather. So, overall history does tend to lead us to most areas getting pretty good rainfall though throughout the course of the summer season. So, I'm still optimistic about it, really.
Got a couple of quick questions left for you. First of all, can you give us a quick overview of the South American weather situation? I know that the soybean harvest there is pretty much complete, but what about for the safrinha crop?
Yep, soybeans are done, and the safrinha corn in Brazil, I just looked at it this morning and now I forget, but I think on the whole, I think somewhere around 40% is already filling and about 1% is harvested. So we're getting towards the tail end of where weather is important. They could use a good rainfall down there in Brazil to kind of finish everything out. They've been dry the last couple of weeks. Now, that's not abnormal. This is normally the dry season anyway in Brazil, where rains basically just shut off and you don't see them again until September. But occasionally we can get a system moving up from Argentina. It looks like there might be one here coming this weekend into next week. And if it does, it would be helpful. A lot of that crop got planted on the later side, so they could use that rainfall. But overall, it's not like the crop is made, but it's in a pretty good shape overall. There are just some kind of really minor concerns with dryness at this point, and everything's kind of heading towards the finish line at this point. So good finishing rain for them would be good for them, bad for us and markets, of course. But that looks like it might occur next week, and that would probably be the end of it for them. Frost can still have an issue there. We don't see anything coming up in the short term over the next couple of weeks that's overly concerning. But it would have to be a pretty strong one now at this point of the year to really have an impact. So less concerned about that as well. Everything's kind of in a pretty good spot there in Brazil.
All right, and then our last question, John. We just got done with the hard red winter wheat tour in Kansas. It looked like a pretty dire situation as far as the moisture levels there. With an El Nino pattern coming in and potentially bringing more moisture to that part of the country, how long would it really take to get soil moisture levels back to a more normal level? And perhaps will they be in a better situation come next fall for wheat planting?
I'm hoping so. To answer the last part of that question, I'm hoping that we get decent enough rains here during the summertime where we're not worsening the drought, because summer tends to be the season in that part of the area where it's hot anyway. Temperatures are typically in the 90s on a daily basis anyway, and precipitation kind of shifts its way a little bit farther north where we don't get as much precipitation during the summer season. So hopefully we get enough rainfall that it doesn't get any worse during the summer. But it's the fall season by itself is probably not going to eliminate the drought. I mean, like I mentioned, it's been there since basically June 2020 and hasn't really looked back. We got a little bit of a break in summer of 2021, but it was brief. So they've really been dealing with it for 3 years. So that dryness has been entrenched for a very, very long time. One season of rainfall is not likely to do it unless we get something like what happened in California, and they just got pounded with 400% precipitation over the course of the winter and early spring season. So that's what it would take to kind of do it over a short period of time. Now, that doesn't mean that you need that. You don't need the drought to be gone to plant into decent conditions for winter wheat. If we get normal rainfall here, drought kind of just falls off by kind of dropping off those drier periods that have occurred earlier. And if we keep getting normal precipitation, that would tend to lead us into pretty good shape. But to really get rid of the effects of that drought, not only we're going to need to see El Nino play a significant role here through fall, but we're also going to need to have it go through the winter and early spring season as well. History shows us that would be a very favorable plan for them, and hopefully that turns out to be the case, but nothing's ever guaranteed with weather. We'll just have to keep our eyes on the skies for that.
Absolutely. Mother Nature is just a little fickle. All right. Thank you. Thank you, John, for joining us. This is John Barnick, DTN's ag meteorologist. He's based out of Burnsville, Minnesota. All right. And now I want to turn our attention to our next guest and a topic that all of you are very interested in. That this was the year of the hedger. And I think that's a good way to frame it. And so I know you're going to give us a grain market outlet. Go ahead, take it away.
All right, very good. Thank you, Katie. All right, let's go ahead and bring up the first slide. Here we go. Thank you. All right, starting off our Ag Summit series here. Let's just start out with some of the context. I always like to look at the context, what's happening in the outside markets. It's not always just about what our yield guesses are and how much gets planted each year. It's a big world out there, and obviously traders are keenly aware of what's going on in the outside world. In the past few months, the big topic has been the record crops from Brazil, and that continues. We've seen a record soybean harvest come in from Brazil already. That harvest is just wrapping up now. And as you heard John talk about, Brazil also has prospects for record crop production if that safrinha corn crop comes through as good as it's looking right now. So that's very tough bearish pressure on the market. Outside, as far as Fed policy, we still have pressure to raise interest rates. The inflation pressures have eased. They've come down somewhat, but we're not at that 2% target level yet. So there is still expectation that the Fed could keep raising the interest rate again. And of course, that puts pressure on traders and outlooks. We have energy prices down from a year ago, thankfully. We had kind of an expensive summer last summer for gas and diesel fuel prices, but those prices are coming down. That helps somewhat. We're seeing fertilizer prices come down, and with fertilizer prices, also transportation costs. I'll be showing slides of that in just a second. The good news there, Katie, is that a lot of the problems that cropped out of COVID and all the entangled messes and knots that we had for the economy are finally starting to unravel, and we're seeing a return to normalcy in a lot of areas. And then most recently, we have this debt ceiling argument going on between the president and the Congress, and there's lots of questions about how that's going to be worked out, so traders are a little nervous about that. So with that kind of backdrop in mind, here's the fertilizer prices, fertilizer prices, as I mentioned, are normalizing. Last spring, you're all painfully aware of how expensive that got. Even if you did fall application, you were still paying some pretty expensive prices for fertilizer. Well, since fall, the good news is fertilizer prices have come down roughly 40 to 42%, actually since that spring peak of a year ago. Part of that is also as we return to more normal production of natural gas. You can see on the lower part of the slide, we're down below $3 now per billion cubic feet. That's a big relief on natural gas. That natural gas and storage up almost a third from where it was a year ago, and of course that is a big help to the fertilizer prices, as well as just the better transportation that we have going on throughout the country. As far as transporting grain overseas, we're seeing a big relief in those costs as well. It was back not that long ago. We were paying very expensive Panamax prices, and of course there was a lot of port congestion that made things worse. A lot of that really has resolved itself. I don't expect Panamax prices to get much lower, but they're down about 39% from the peak of the problems. Now, we're a little up from the pandemic low, but this seems to be a much more normal place when it comes to the costs of shipping grain. So that just helps make everything easier as far as commerce for grain. Diesel prices. Last year, we're keenly aware, crude oil got over $100, almost $120 a barrel. Diesel rose along with it. We've seen a great relief in both of those prices. A lot of that due, I think, to concerns about slower economic growth ahead and the effect that the higher interest rates have had. But I want to caution here that even though our diesel prices are down about $1.50 from where they were a year ago at this time, diesel supplies are still at near their lowest levels in 9 years. So this is a market that could still creep up and bite us in the months ahead if something were to interrupt. You may know that OPEC cut its production again starting in May. So the balance between world oil supplies or production and the demand for that world oil still remains very tight with very thin margins. So this is a market that could change quickly. If you need to take advantage of cheaper fuel prices, this might not be a bad time if that's a concern. All right, let's get into the specifics now. We'll start to take a look at some of the numbers and just what's happening in the corn market. And of course, we're dealing with old crop and new crop. First, I just want to start with the price of the new crop. December corn and where it's been. And you can see that early on, in about December and January, December corn prices started sagging below the 100-day average. That's the blue line on this chart, but they held together fairly well. And frankly, I don't usually like to put on new crop hedges that early in the year. Typically, April is kind of a nice ideal time, and it takes some of the time risk out of what's happening. But this is a market that had a lot on its mind, and the way things turned out, it forced our hand to put on those hedges earlier than usual, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But you see the first red arrow shows when the USDA Ag Forum Outlook got together toward the end of February. I think it was about February 23, and they released their new crop estimates. And I don't think it was a shock to any of us that are used to penciling the numbers and trying to think of what the season might look as far as what's ahead of us, especially if we have good weather, as our DTN meteorologist John Barnick has been talking about since December, that we're probably in store for a better weather year here in 2023. But it seemed to just kind of bring together everybody's concerns that, you know what, we've had 2 years of tight supplies, we've had 2 years of nice higher prices, and how long is that going to last? And it just looked from early on that there was a risk that we were going to come in with bigger crops this year. That's what USDA pointed out in their early session of that Ag Forum Outlook, and that actually triggered the first wave of selling that we saw in December corn this year. Then that was held up a little bit. China started buying corn in March. Now typically that's very late for the U.S. to start getting active in their export sales in March, but we've been competing with Brazil through this whole time, and they've really been tough on us. Brazil had a record crop last year. Those supplies were still cheap and available, and we didn't really see much business start to pick up until China showed up in March. Well, as you know now, that didn't last a long time, and that whole story has changed. Now with expectation of a big crop coming from Brazil, we've seen cancellations come from China, which started in late April. That triggered another leg of selling down. So it's been a very tough start, and frankly, this is a much earlier sell-off in the season than we usually see for something like this. But I think part of it is you have to keep in mind that I think it was just on everybody's radar that, we've been in this very tight supply, high price situation. How long is it going to last? And if people are going to start talking about better weather conditions, we could be looking at a much different scenario, and that seems to be exactly what we're doing right now. Here's Brazil, and I think probably every farm show I go to, I've been showing that the competition of the future is Brazil. That is the big concern. And here's a chart that I think shows that Brazil's corn production is represented by the blue bars. The red line represents the amount of corn that Brazil consumes each year, and as you can see, especially since probably the past 15 or 20 years, there's been an extraordinary increase in the corn production coming from Brazil as they continue to expand their cropland acres. And there's just no sign of that stopping anytime soon. This year will be, if it turns out to be record production again, it will be the 8th year since 2010 that Brazil is producing a record corn crop, and it looks like right now USDA's best estimate is about 2.1 billion bushels. As far as the exports go in the current season, they're easily passing us on the export total, and that's the first time in history we've seen that. So Brazil is on the rise and is not getting any easier to compete with. Now, how do we know Brazil's crop's any good? Well, it's tough, and lots of times you're relying on secondary information and reports from South America. And I always like to look at the prices of corn in Brazil, just as to get information about China. I like to look at the prices of corn and soybeans in China. In this case, if you look at the lower chart, July corn on the Bovespa exchange in Brazil, you can see that about mid to late March, those prices started hitting new lows. We've had a long, just solid slide lower, and basically that those new lows started when at first the soybean harvest was a little wet, and it wasn't sure just when that corn would get planted and if it would get planted in a good, timely manner. But when that concern started to free up, it just seemed like Katie barred the door for lower corn prices in Brazil. We've seen about a 36% drop in Brazil's corn price the past 2 months. They're now down below $5 a bushel as a translated price for sure. I think they're around $4.50 or $6 a bushel this morning, but that's been a very tough, sharp drop. And as you can see, it's had an influence on our July corn price pictured above. Those July corn prices were holding steady fairly well right up until the Ag Outlook Forum at the end of February. Then they had that sell-off that I mentioned, but just have not been able to hold up. And as you can see by the blue line, they haven't been able to trade above the 100-day average. So whatever they've been able to rotate higher, it's been a weak rotation, and the dominant direction for July corn has been down. So it's been a tough market, obviously. I'll talk a little more about our strategies on that in just a minute here. The one bright spot for corn was the basis this year, and the national corn basis is a picture of domestic demand for old crop corn, and it's still quite strong. It's the strongest basis we've seen in over 20 years. Unfortunately, I do not expect that to be at that level next year or when we talk about the new crop season. But right now, 34 cents above the July contract is where our DTN National Index of cash corn prices stands. That was at 605 last night. So throughout the U.S., there's still strong demand for corn, and especially in the western corn belt where they were dry and they didn't have hay and other feed available for their livestock. The local basis, the local prices have held up real well. And for one reason, I thought initially that old crop prices would hold up better than they did. You know, typically we usually get the seasonal highs in corn in May, but that just was not the case this year. There was just too much bearish expectation looking forward. This chart, it can be a little confusing, but I'll just try to get to the point here. Normally when we look at future spreads, if the front month contract is priced higher than the second contract, we call that a bullish spread or a bullish inverse because it typically signifies that commercial demand is strong for that front month and they want the product now. Here in this case, we've had bullish spreads throughout this season and through this season of lower prices. And I wanted to point out that future spreads really depend on the context they're in. So the green line's the May contract, the blue line's the July contract. May's been trading above July throughout the early part of 2023. But if you notice that July corn contract started weakening versus July right about April, and that was shortly after Brazil's crop started taking on a more bearish outlook. Well, if you just have a simple definition of future spreads are always bullish if the front month's higher, then this looks like it was getting more and more bullish. But in this context, that wasn't the case. The July contract basically was losing value because of the expectation of the Brazil crop looking better and better and better. And so what we had here was actually a time where what looked to be like a bullish spread was not. And the other part of this transition, if you look at the black line, that's the December corn price. Keep in mind we're transitioning through the summer months from an old crop season to a new crop season. And in the new crop season, we're looking for much more corn supply than we've seen in the old crop season. So now, if you look at the red line, that's our cash price. That's our DTN National Corn Index. That actually peaked in early April, which, as I said, is earlier than usual. And the reason it peaked, and it's the reason it's turned weak and is selling off, is because we're transitioning from these tight old crop supplies, which look good in the May period, but are looking less and less bullish as we progress through the months. And so that's where we're at right now. We're in this transitional period. The cash is still priced above the July, but it's still on its way to a lower December price. And so we're going to continue to see that pressure in the cash prices. and again, I'll talk about our strategy with that in just a second. Here's the early new crop corn balance sheet from USDA. On the left is the May estimates that just came out. And on the right, I kept my estimates from when we talked last time in February, just as a comparison. So USDA still stuck with its 92 million acre planting estimate. I still think that's a little high. And with the problems in North Dakota, there will likely be some prevented acres in my view. Their yield estimate, 181.5, is not a bad starting estimate. I don't have an argument with that. In February, I started with 185 because we had a very good weather outlook for the season ahead. Now, that drew some gasps from the crowd, understandably. We haven't been to 185 in quite a while, but keep in mind that's only about 4% above trend, which is not unheard of in history. Today, I would adjust that down to 182, which is 2% above trend, but I'm still looking for a favorable crop season, and in fact it may come in higher than 182, but for what we know right now, 182 seems like a reasonable start. Our production totals didn't differ much. We were both a little bit over 15 billion bushels. USDA's ending stocks estimate, 2.22 billion bushels, is 15% of annual use. My estimate a few months ago was just under 2.2, but today, looking at that, I have to say there's risk that that ending stocks estimate is going to be higher than 2.2. And I say that because I think a lot of the demand estimates on USDA's balance sheet are just too optimistic right now, especially with the competition we're getting from Brazil. So I'm very concerned about just how low these new crop corn prices are going to go. USDA's farm price estimate is $4.80 a bushel. I think that's going to be too high when it's all said and done, and I think you're going to be very glad to have that crop insurance in place and any hedges that you put on. Corn pricing. Okay. The red is the July corn price over the last several months. Blue is the December corn price. And then as you see, the December corn prices are getting down to roughly where the level of 85% crop revenue crop insurance could give you some protection. Now, well, before I get to that, let me just say our old crop sales, we were out of the old crop business on February 15th. So thankfully we got out before the Feb ag outlook sell-off, and those things started triggering lower prices. We came out with an average of 77 on March, which is probably one of the better things we've done lately. And then new crop corn, in late February and early March, we started recommending some new crop corn forward sales, and right now we're 50% forward sold at an average of 568 when December corn was trading at that price, so we're a little ahead there. Now, the point I was going to make is when the prices get down to where your crop insurance picks up the coverage, what should you do? Should you, well, in the case of making forward sales, just stick with it till you deliver. But some guys might have put on shorts as far as futures hedges go. And in that case, you have an option at some point, if it gets into your crop insurance projection, you can buy back your futures and let the crop insurance protect you from that point on. But in the case of corn, because I do think we have much higher supplies ahead of us that are still not fully appreciated by the market, I think you would probably be wise to at least keep that 50% protection in place. So if you're short futures, you might actually have a little more protection when you include the crop insurance. But given the outlook for the price right now, I would suggest keeping that protection on as my best advice. All right, let's take a look at soybeans. We're going to see a lot of similarities, but also some important differences. In the case of soybeans, here's the November soybean price. We actually had a bit of a sell-off back in early January, but again, I don't typically like to make new crop sales quite that early in time, especially in the case of soybeans. We had an extremely bullish old crop outlook starting the year off, between having a strong pace of export sales and having the new expansion of renewable diesel taking place, that I felt would at least support new crop prices for a while. Well, obviously there were some unexpected things that came up, as there often is. And by the way, that's a good reason maybe to check in with us more than just once every 3 months or once a year. If you can subscribe and get our daily market outlook, it might help you keep updated with the changes that do happen. And some of the changes that nobody expected was all of a sudden we had some U.S. bank failures. It turns out those higher interest rates have some complications, and they exposed the banks that were not doing a good job of managing that interest rate risk. So that really hit the market pretty hard in early March. About that same time, we started seeing a break in China's soybean prices, and that was unexpected because China's soybean demand actually stayed very strong through the latter half of 2022 and was looking very good and promising in early 2023. But then when we got to early March, it started breaking new lows, and so that forced our hands as far as having to consider some new crop sales earlier than we would normally like. Well, as you can see, it's been downhill since then, and we broke through the $12 mark last week, and we're still trading right around that area. But USDA is looking for new crop ending stocks of 335 million bushels versus 215 in the current season. I don't think we're done yet. There's probably going to be a little more upside on those new crop ending stocks, as best I can tell. Brazil's expansion has been even more aggressive in soybeans than it has been corn. We've had a solid over 2 decades of aggressive expansion in soybean production in Brazil. Brazil has been the world's top supplier for many years already, and of course they're the main supplier to China, with incredible potential to keep increasing cropland acres for years to come. And it's no surprise that China's making big investments in Brazil's infrastructure to keep that supply happening for them. Well, we already had the record crop, so this is the 9th record crop since 2010 on soybeans coming in. Again, 5.7 billion bushels this year, and the early guess for next year is right around 6 billion bushels. So Brazil continues to be a very tough competitor on soybeans as well. This is a chart that shows China's soybean production. That's the blue bars at the bottom, and as you can tell, they don't produce many soybeans. They made a decision to rely on that import market, and they do. But the red line is the amount of soybeans that China consumes every year, and as you can see, that continues to have a strong upward slope. So China's economy continues to grow in spite of COVID, in spite of the problems they've had, in spite of some of their financial hiccups. The soybean demand continues to grow in China, and that's impressive, and they can do that thanks largely to Brazil. It was about in 2017 when Brazil started out selling us when it came to exports, and we've created quite a gap now. U.S. soybean basis, like corn, it's not the strongest in 20 years, but it's the 4th strongest that we've seen since 2010, and it compares very well. So we've had good demand situation for the old crop soybeans. Of course, a lot of that has been due to the expansion of the renewable diesel, and I'll talk about that. But the crush plants had fantastic returns in late 2022 and early 2023, but that's changed a bit here the past couple months. Here's the crush incentives based on the July futures contract. So the blue line, July soybean crush value. So what do you get from crushing a bushel of soybeans? You get meal and bean oil, and of course that's worth more than the soybeans themselves. The difference is the crush premium. It used to be above $3 in early March. Now we're down just under the $2 mark for the crush premium. So it's still profitable. There's still very active crush going on, but a couple things are happening. Old crop soybean supplies in the U.S. are tight, so they have to ration back this crush pace to stretch out the soybean supply that we have this summer. That's part of what's happening. The other part was a bit unexpected. You know, we have this very strong bullish story about increasing renewable diesel production. There's a lot of investment going in it. There's a lot of plant expansion. And now the EPA came out and put out a proposal for a renewable volume obligation of like 2.82 billion gallons. Well, in 2022, we already produced over 3 billion gallons. And with the new investment, with the new plants coming online for renewable diesel, that production number is just going to increase as the years go on here, the next 2 or 3 years, or at least that's been the plan. But the catch is, and here's the monkey wrench, if EPA's RVO commitment does not try to at least keep pace with that expansion, it's going to severely curtail the tax credit incentives that are available that make this whole thing work. So the biodiesel being turned more into renewable diesel gets benefit from the traditional tax credit, it gets benefit from the low carbon policies in California, and it also gets benefit from the RVO commitment in the renewable fuel standard. And if that RVO commitment doesn't keep up, well then perhaps a lot of these expansion plans might be put on hold, or we just don't know what the future of that is right now. So the bean oil market has been a little bit nervous lately. We're supposed to get the final release from June 14th from EPA, and we'll see how that turns out. But it seems to have put in quite a damper, for the moment anyway, on the enthusiasm of using more bean oil to produce renewable diesel. As you can see, here is from the Energy Department. This chart shows that the amount of soybean oil used to make biofuels every month continues to increase. Over the past 12 months, bean oil demand's been up 15% from the previous year, and it's the plant capacity. It's more than doubled from a year ago, and the latest stats, I should point out, are as of February, so we're a little bit behind. But there continues to be very strong investment in building of new plant capacity that's expected to continue into 2025 at least. So it's on a very strong uptrack, but it needs some help from EPA. Similar to what you saw in corn, here are USDA's latest May estimates for new crop corn, and I left my estimates from the February Ag Summit to the right. USDA sticking with their 87.5 million acres of soybean plantings. I think there is some question in the market. If North Dakota loses some corn acres, is it possible they might pick up some soybean acres? That could be one issue. USDA's yield estimate, 52 bushels an acre, is roughly a trendline yield. My estimate early is 54. And I think given John and the DTN team, what they're telling us about the crop season ahead, I don't think there's anything outrageous about 54 bushels an acre for beans. USDA's crop estimate, 4.5 billion bushels. I'm a little higher. Ending stocks, they're saying 335 million bushels. That's just under an 8% ending stocks to use ratio. I'm a little higher at 400 million bushels with a 9% ending stocks to use ratio. Now the interesting thing is, I should mention for ending stocks ratios, if you compare, the dividing line between profitable and unprofitable prices for soybeans has been the 12% mark, or excuse me, the 10% mark. So even if we come in at 335 million bushels, you would still expect soybeans to have chances for profitable prices. And even at my 9% estimate, you would expect a slight chance for profitable prices on soybeans in the year ahead. But here we are, we're already trading below $12 on the November contract. And I think part of the problem is there's been a lot of specs in the long side of beans, and there's been a lot of liquidation going on the way down. So it's quite possible that the market will take that a little lower than we would normally expect fundamentally. And as you know, specs can have a big sway in the market. Well, USDA's estimated price is $12.10 a bushel. Even with a higher supply estimate, I expect $12.70 a bushel. Now, that's just a fundamental guess. To me, the real proof of the pudding is where does the market actually trade? and that's always the important factor to take into consideration. Lastly, soybean pricing in 2023, similar to corn, our old crop sales were we got out of by the end of February 28, average $14.93 roughly on the July soybean price. Actually, I think it was on May prices that it was based on. As you can see, the November soybean price has fallen below 12 here. We're down very close to where the crop revenue insurance would start to kick in if you had 85% protection. And keep in mind, I'm assuming that those yields stay even with your average history. So those prices that I say, $11.70 for 85% coverage, that fluctuates with your yield, so keep that in mind. In the case of soybeans, if prices got much lower, now we're forward sold 50% on the beans at an average of $13.43. So we'll just take those forward sales right to deliver at harvest. But if you sold futures contracts, then if the price got much cheaper here, if you got down around $11 or so, it might not be a bad opportunity to cover your futures as hedges, let the crop insurance protect you, and then if you do get a surprise weather problem or summer rally, you could possibly have a chance to hedge again. So just something to throw that out there for your consideration. I know every farm's different, every situation's different, and you have to do what's best for you. Well, that does my talk for the day, but I'm always open for a good question, Katie.
And we've got a couple of them, Todd. Looking at it here, I think one of the first questions we got in was actually regarding the Ukraine and Russia situation and how the markets are really pricing that in.
Yeah, obviously my assessment of that situation has been off for for a good year here. I really thought Putin would be more disruptive into the wheat market, and I thought there would be more things happen over the winter time, perhaps, that he would take advantage of. But actually, he's behaved as well as you could expect Mr. Putin to behave in terms of allowing the grain corridor and the ships to go and the exports to come out. That's been a bit surprising to me. So they just extended the Black Sea Agreement again just a little bit ago, another 2 months, they say. You never know still if Russia is actually going to inspect or not, or they seem to drag their feet a lot. There's also a little conflict right now because Russia is not approving any ships into the third port, which is Pivdeny, I believe, and that's supposed to be one of the protected ports. It also bothers me that from time to time Russia sends missiles to Odessa, which is also supposed to be another protected port in the Black Sea Grain Agreement. I still have to believe that this situation is as dangerous and potentially volatile as it has been since the war started. I don't know that anybody has a good notion of how it's going to finish, but there is an anticipation that fighting's going to increase this summer. I think there's just no doubt about it. That whether which side, whether it comes from Ukraine mounting a counteroffensive or Russia just getting more aggressive, it just seems like the situation's going to be worse. And as this wears on, it becomes more and more difficult for Ukraine to produce anything. Their corn production is holding up fairly well. Their wheat production is going to suffer again this year, so it's one of those things that there's just no good way to predict with any confidence. But that you could wake up any morning and find the world much different and find a market very scared by what just happened, and so it's hard to make that call.
Now, there's another big thing going on in the markets that could be scary in a lot of ways, maybe not particularly to corn and beans, but we know it would have spillover effects. Looking ahead, we're facing a debt ceiling potential default. What happens if we cross that line, or what's your concerns and thoughts in that arena, Todd?
Yeah, well, we've been through this before. It seems to come down to who flinches, or can they find some agreement where they can both claim victory and come out of this. But I would like to believe that as crazy as Washington seems sometimes, that both sides would understand how serious it is that the U.S. continue to be known as a place that pays their bills. And the disruption to the economy and really to the reputation of the country is what I think would be most at stake. And of course, it paralyzes a certain part of the economy when you go to in a freeze or a shutdown, if that sort of thing happens. And it's just there is nothing good that comes out of crossing the line and not finding a way to work this out. So, I just have to hope for the best.
Yeah, that is one of those things that has to be settled in Washington.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed when you showed the soybean basis chart, up at the very top, the highest price was 2013, and it just tanked straight down. And we know that in 2012 we went off that drought year, and 2013 rapidly rebuilt stocks for both corn and soybeans.
Yeah.
Are we looking at a potentially that type of a move in our cash soybean price this year?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're already seeing that, really, to be honest. And it's very similar to what I showed in corn, that even though the corn price peaked in early April, it's been on a downhill slide since now. And it's just a good reminder that even when, in 2013 was a good reminder too, that even when you have tight supplies, there comes a time when demand is satiated. And once you hit that point, tight supplies or no tight supplies, that market will get ready to give. And that's, I think we've already obviously turned that corner.
Okay. Using your crystal ball, if there is a chance for a summer rally, what might be the cause, or what things are you watching closely this summer to give you indications of the market?
Yeah, well, I think the most obvious candidate is always weather for a summer rally. And, we're starting out now with the dry 7-day forecast for the central and eastern Midwest. Like John, I'm not too upset about it at the moment, but you never know if it persists longer than people expect. Or, John's also mentioned that because we don't have a strong driver of the weather scenario this summer, we're going to have kind of hit and miss areas of rain. And so the question is which areas get hit and which areas get missed. And if there's significant enough pockets that get missed, then that would certainly dent yields.
Absolutely. I know there are some places right now where they're talking a little bit of replanting here, a little replanting there, but not quite significant to the market yet. Not enough to drop these crop predictions down?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And by the way, next Monday we'll get our first crop progress report of corn conditions.
Okay.
So I'm guessing it's going to start on the high side.
I think that's probably a smart guess there.
Yeah.
Safe one. All right. Well, Todd Hultman, DTN lead analyst, thank you for joining me in studio today. We always like having you on.
Thank you, Katie.
All right, now we're going to take a really quick break here. We're going to switch to bring in our editor-in-chief of Progressive Farmer Magazine, Gregg Hillyer, for a little bit of analysis of how today went. We are running a little bit along, but that's okay. We think we've brought you a lot of really good content. I wouldn't want to leave anything short. I will say we are going to start that Zoom coffee shop talk as soon as we finish this formal program. So take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to our studio. I'm so excited to have with me a Progressive Farmer editor-in-chief, Gregg Hillyer. Gregg, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Katie. Thanks.
So tell me a little bit, Gregg, you've been watching all day. What do you think are some of the key things that our growers and our attendees should really take away from our content?
Right. Well, I thought it was really interesting when you kind of changed the format this session to talk to more to farmers. A lot of our stories, we always talk about farmers talking to farmers, and I thought they really gave a good overview on how planting has progressed, since they started, and how kind of the crop conditions are. And for the most part, everyone's really optimistic. Obviously, there's been some trouble spots in Ohio, for example, and Minnesota and Dakotas, but farmers are really optimistic that crops are off to a really strong start.
Although there are a few places where we were struggling. We heard from our staff reporter, Russ Quinn, that he's got some dryness issues in Nebraska. Then up in Minnesota, they're really thinking hard about some replant and issues. What are some of the other things that you think were notable for people today?
Yeah, I think the main thing is, you have to be optimistic, eternal optimist, as they say, to be a farmer. And a lot has to happen between now and harvest, and the crop is safely in the bin. But I think farmers are really good at adapting and adjusting, despite the curves. As Russ mentioned, the dry weather, he's concerned about, hay and pasture and things like that. But farmers have a way to overcome a lot of that, assuming Mother Nature doesn't get in the way too much.
And we heard that we could have a very interesting situation with Mother Nature this year from John Barnick and a potential super El Nino. We'll see if it gets there. If it's not a super El Nino, it'll likely still be a strong one.
Yeah, El Nino, we're finally on the cusp, as he said, which for the most part means really favorable growing conditions for the rest of the summer. For most areas, obviously John pointed out there's going to be some variability, as there always is with weather, but for the most part, I think those severe extremes are going to be very limited this year.
And I think that plays in really well to what we heard from our conversation with Erik Oberbroekling and Marc Arnusch, and just the way they viewed the marketing aspects of this year and called it the year of the hedger. And really sort of this is one of those years where forward selling ahead of time was probably a wise choice, given just the good growing conditions that Mother Nature seems to have up her sleeve. We'll see.
Right. Marketing is always key for farmers' profitability. I think this year especially, over the past 2 years, we've had really strong prices, but farmers really need to pay attention to their marketing plan this year.
Now, Gregg, you're the editor-in-chief of our magazine, Progressive Farmer. What are some of the things that you're really looking at as you start planning for future issues as things that farmers are going to have to think about?
Right. Profitability is always key to a lot of our coverage, but Mark talked about how excited he is about all the new technology that's coming onto the forefront in farming, AI and precision ag, and just what it means to help farms to be more profitable, more efficient, and just do a better overall job. So to us, that's an area we're really watching. We talked a little bit too about the Dicamba, tweaks to Dicamba, applications and timings and cutoff dates, things of that sort. So regulations and what that means for farmers and how they can use pesticides, now and in the future will be top of mind as well.
All right, Gregg, anything else?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, those who registered and attended, and we'll have more of these later this year and hope you'll join us then.
Absolutely, and if you've got a little bit of time left in your morning, please join us for our Zoom coffee shop call. There is a link for that in the agenda as well as on the community page. We're hoping to see you there. Like Gregg said, we'll have a few more of these Ag Summit Series events. We'll have one in August talking about the results of our DTN Digital Yield Tour. We'll also be looking ahead towards the fall weather a little bit more than what John gave us today. Todd Hultman will talk a bit about the grain markets there, always of interest at that point of the growing season. We'll talk a little bit about our input purchasing decisions in that event. And then I also want to make sure to invite you to our full DTN Ag Summit in December. We'll be in a format similar to this. It'll be a two-morning event. We'll cover lots of topics focused on macroeconomic conditions. We'll talk about some of the business topics that really matter at that time of year, things like taxes. We'll dive into ag policy and a few of our other traditional Ag Summit topics. So that wraps up our formal program for today. I'm so grateful you all joined us. I hope you have a safe, if you haven't already finished, a safe finish to your planting season. I wish you a safe growing season and a prosperous year. Take care.